She had $1 billion in her name, and not a single person left to call. One morning, Sienna Ashford woke up in a 5-star suite. By nightfall, her accounts were frozen, her lawyers had stopped returning calls, and the man she had trusted with her empire had made sure the world believed she was the criminal. She drove until the city lights disappeared, until the mountains swallowed her whole, until the car sputtered and died on a dark street in a town she'd never heard of. This is the story of how losing everything became the only way to find something real. If this story moves you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The car smelled like cold coffee and 3-day-old regret. Sienna Ashford sat behind the wheel of a 2009 Volvo S60, a car she'd borrowed from her assistant, Monica, before Monica had quietly stopped answering her phone, and stared at a cracked windshield that someone had patched with clear tape and good intentions. Outside, Asheville, North Carolina moved through the gray November morning like it had somewhere better to be. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, a woman arguing on her phone outside a bakery. Normal, unremarkable, relentless life. Sienna hadn't slept. Not really. She dozed in 30-minute intervals, her neck bent against the headrest at an angle that would make her pay for it later, jolting awake every time a car door slammed or headlights swept across the rear window. By 5 in the morning, she'd given up pretending and just sat there watching the sky change from black to purple to the flat, non-committal gray of a day that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. She was 30 years old. 18 months ago, she'd been on the cover of Forbes, photographed on the rooftop terrace of the Ashford Grand Meridian in Charleston, her flagship property, 12 stories of restored antebellum architecture with a rooftop garden and a restaurant that had a 4-month wait list. The caption had read, "Sienna Ashford, the woman who reinvented Southern luxury." She'd hated that headline at the time. Thought it was too small, too regional. She'd wanted something bigger, something that acknowledged the international reach she was building. The resort in Portugal, the boutique hotel acquisition in Kyoto, the partnership talks with a Singapore-based hospitality group. She would have given anything to go back to hating that headline. 3 weeks earlier, she had been sitting in a conference room on the 41st floor of a glass tower in Charlotte when Richard Ashford's lawyer not her lawyer, Richard's, had slid a manila folder across the mahogany table and told her with the particular kind of polite violence that expensive attorneys specialize in that her signature appeared on 47 documents authorizing wire transfers totaling just over $11 million to offshore accounts she had never heard of. "That's not my signature," she said. "The handwriting analysis confirms otherwise," the lawyer said. "I'm telling you that is not my signature." "Ms. Ashford." He folded his hands. He had cufflinks. Of course he had cufflinks. "I would strongly encourage you to speak with your own legal representation before saying anything further." The problem was that her legal representation, a team of 4 attorneys she had paid an aggregate of $800,000 over the past 2 years, had already been quietly informed, through channels she didn't yet understand, that the firm's senior partner had a long-standing personal relationship with Richard Ashford's family. By the time she walked out of that conference room, 2 of her 4 attorneys had cited a conflict of interest and withdrawn. A third stopped returning calls within 24 hours. The 4th, a young associate named Priya, had called her that evening and said, in a voice that suggested she was speaking from somewhere she could be overheard, "Sienna, I can't represent you formally, but off the record, get your personal financial records, everything you have access to right now, tonight, because by tomorrow morning you may not have access anymore." Sienna had stayed up until 3 a.m. downloading documents, screenshots, email threads, anything she could get to before the walls closed in. By 6 a.m., she was on the road. By noon, her access to the company's financial systems had been revoked. By 5 p.m., her business accounts, the ones tied to Ashford Hospitality Group, which she had founded at 23 with a single inherited property and a business plan she'd written at her mother's kitchen table, were frozen pending investigation. Her personal savings account, also frozen, because the investigation had flagged it as potentially containing misappropriated funds. She had $2,340 in cash, a credit card she wasn't sure would work, a phone with 47 unread messages she wasn't ready to open, and Monica's Volvo. She drove west because she'd never been to Asheville, and she didn't want to be anywhere anyone might recognize her. She'd found the parking spot by accident, wedging the Volvo into a narrow gap between a florist delivery van and a wooden fence on a side street 1 block off the main drag. It was the kind of neighborhood that was in the early stages of becoming something. A few renovated storefronts, a coffee place with exposed brick, and a handwritten chalkboard menu, an antique shop with a good eye for window display. But there were still gaps, buildings that hadn't been touched yet. One of them, a converted industrial space with wide wooden doors and a hand-painted sign that read, Mercer Woodworks. Custom furniture and architectural millwork occupied most of the block's remaining space. She hadn't noticed the faded yellow markings on the asphalt beneath her tires until her second morning there. Delivery access. No overnight parking. She'd been there 2 nights. On the first morning, she'd walked to a gas station 2 blocks away and bought a bottle of water, a banana, and a pack of crackers with one of her $20 bills, doing the kind of mental math she hadn't done since college. The anxious, compulsive arithmetic of a person recalculating how much longer they can last. She'd eaten sitting on a low stone wall outside a church, watching pigeons fight over a hot dog bun, and she'd thought, I am 30 years old and I am eating crackers on a wall. She wasn't crying. That was the strange part. She'd expected to cry more. Instead, she felt a kind of vast, buzzing emptiness, like the signal had dropped and she was waiting for something, anything, to come back in. On the second night, the temperature dropped hard. She ran the car for heat in 30-minute intervals, rationing the gas, and lay across the back seat wrapped in a fleece blanket she'd found in the trunk. Monica's probably, along with a pair of running shoes and a library book 3 weeks overdue. She fell asleep reading the back cover. She didn't hear him approach. The first thing she knew was a knock on the driver's side window. Measured, not aggressive, 3 deliberate taps. And she came up from sleep so fast that she knocked her elbow against the door handle and made a sound that was embarrassingly close to a yelp. The man standing outside was maybe early 30s, wearing a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt, sawdust on his forearms, and a look on his face that was more curious than threatening. He had dark eyes and the kind of jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days, not because he was making a statement about it, but because he'd clearly been too busy to bother. He was holding a paper cup of coffee. He gestured at the window. Sienna sat up, ran her hand over her hair, a completely instinctive gesture that she immediately felt foolish about, and cracked the window 2 inches. "Morning," he said. His voice was unhurried, southern without being theatrical about it. "Sorry to wake you up. You parked over the delivery markings. I've got a truck coming at 8. She looked at the dash clock, 7:42. "I'll move," she said. "Take your time. I just wanted to give you a heads up." He started to step back, then paused. "You doing all right?" It was such a simple question, the kind people asked without meaning it, the verbal equivalent of a courtesy wave. But something about the way he said it, the slight pause before all right, like he'd actually looked at her and factored what he saw into the question, made the back of her throat tighten. "Fine," she said, "just passing through." He nodded, accepting that at face value, and went back inside. She moved the car. There was a legal parking spot half a block down that she hadn't noticed before, and she pulled into it and sat there for a minute with the engine running, feeling the particular shame of someone who has been seen in a way they hadn't consented to. Not that he'd said anything. He'd been perfectly decent. That almost made it worse. She turned the engine off, checked her phone. 11 new messages since last night. 3 from journalists. She didn't recognize the numbers, but the area codes were Charlotte and New York, and the texts had that particular quality of professional intrusion dressed up as concern. Sienna, just reaching out to offer a chance to tell your side. 2 from people she'd considered friends who used the word shocked in ways that made it clear they weren't really shocked so much as recalibrating their relationship to her based on the new information landscape. 1 from her mother, which she opened and then closed again before she'd finished the first line because she wasn't ready for that yet. And 1 from a number she didn't recognize with a North Carolina area code that just said, "I know what Richard did. You have more allies than you think. Don't do anything until you hear from me. EV." She stared at that last one for a long time. She didn't know anyone with the initials EV. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat. At 8:15, she was watching a landscaping truck attempt a 3-point turn on the narrow street when the man from the workshop, Logan, she'd see the name on the sign later, came back outside. He had 2 paper cups of coffee this time, and he walked directly to her car with the straightforward purposefulness of someone who'd already decided to do something and wasn't going to overthink it. She rolled the window down. "I figured you might not have eaten," he said, extending one of the cups. "There's a breakfast taco place around the corner, but they don't open until 9. This is just from the coffee maker in the back, but it's real coffee, not the pod stuff." She looked at the cup. "Why?" she said. He seemed mildly surprised by the question. "Why what?" "Why are you bringing me coffee?" "Because you've been in that car since Tuesday, and it's 38 degrees. He said it the way you'd explain something obvious to someone who was slightly confused. "You don't have to drink it." She took the cup. It was too hot and too strong, and tasted like it had been brewing since 6 a.m. in a machine that had seen better days, and it was one of the best things she had ever put in her mouth. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that went beyond the coffee. Logan leaned against the frame of a nearby doorway, not hovering, just present. He drank his own coffee and looked up the street at nothing in particular. "You know," he said after a moment, "parking's better around the back. If you need to stay another night, the alley's private. No delivery markings. Nobody's going to bother you back there." She turned her head to look at him. "You don't know anything about me." "No," he agreed. "I could be anyone." "You could be," he said. "But you've been sitting in the same car for 2 days, and you moved when I asked you to, and you said thank you for the coffee. That's about all I need to know." She didn't have an answer for that. His name was Logan Mercer, and she learned it an hour later when he came out of the workshop a second time to help a delivery driver maneuver a pallet of rough-cut walnut slabs through the double doors, and the driver called him by name. She was still sitting in the car, working her way through the coffee and a mental inventory of her options that kept coming up short. She'd been trying to get a hold of her accountant, not the firm accountant, her personal one, a woman named Diane, who had been with her since the early days, and who Sienna trusted more than almost anyone. But Diane's office number was going to voicemail, and her cell went to voicemail after 2 rings, which meant she was either in a meeting or she'd seen the number and made a choice. Sienna had been making calculations in her head. Not financial ones, not anymore. Different calculations. The kind you make when the spreadsheet is your life and the numbers aren't adding up. She had enough cash for maybe 10 days of cheap motels, food, and gas if she was careful. She had a flash drive with several gigabytes of financial documents she'd downloaded in that frantic pre-dawn session 3 weeks ago, but she didn't know yet what she had or how useful it was. She had a phone full of contacts, most of whom were demonstrating, one non-response at a time, that those contacts were contingent on her being someone with power and money. She had a mystery text from EV, and she had a cup of coffee from a man with sawdust on his arms who hadn't asked her a single question she didn't want to answer. The car wouldn't start at noon. She turned the key and got a sound that was not the sound of an engine starting, a tired, grinding complaint, like the Volvo had heard enough of her problems and was opting out. She tried 3 times, same result. She got out of the car and stood in the pale November sunlight for a moment, hands in the pockets of her coat. A good coat, cashmere, the kind that stuck out against everything else about her current situation like a punchline, and looked up the empty street. "Jumper battery," Logan's voice came from the workshop doorway. He'd apparently seen her repeated attempts through the front window. "I don't know," she admitted. "It was fine this morning." "Pop the hood." He didn't wait for her to agree. He just went back inside and came out 30 seconds later with a flashlight and a set of jumper cables. And he spent the next 5 minutes with his head under the hood while she stood to the side feeling the specific helplessness of someone who has managed billion-dollar logistics operations but cannot explain why a car doesn't start. "Battery's shot," he said, straightening up. "It's not taking a charge." "How long since it's been serviced?" "It's not my car." He processed that without commenting on it. "I've got a spare battery in the back that'll fit this. It's used, but it's solid." He paused. "Or I can call you a tow, if you'd rather." "How much for the battery?" "Nothing. That's not—" "I've got 3 of them back there," he said. "I collect them when customers bring in their trucks. Strip the good ones. Swap them out. It costs me nothing. Give me 20 minutes. She watched him go back inside and tried to figure out why she felt like crying over a car battery. It wasn't the car battery. She knew it wasn't the car battery. She found out his full name and that he had a daughter, when the girl arrived at 4 o'clock on the school bus. Emma Mercer was 9 years old and small for her age, with her father's dark eyes and a backpack covered in enamel pins that clinked softly when she moved. She came through the workshop's side door with the comfortable ownership of a child who has grown up in a parent's workplace, dropped her backpack on a stool, and announced to no one in particular that she'd gotten 100 on her math test. "Good," Logan said from across the workshop, where he was guiding a long board through a planer, not looking up. "Show me." Emma produced the test from her backpack with the specific pride of a kid who knows she's earned something and wants to see it acknowledged properly. Logan turned off the planer, read the test, actually read it, not a glance, and handed it back. "Clean," he said. "I know," Emma said. Sienna was sitting on an old wooden bench just inside the workshop's side door. Logan had offered it when the temperature dropped again around 3, and she'd accepted because she was cold, and because she'd run out of reasons to refuse basic human decency. Emma noticed her with the immediate, uncomplicated directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend not to notice things. "Hi," Emma said. "Hi. Are you Dad's customer?" "No," Sienna said. My car was parked outside. Your dad helped me with the battery." Emma considered this. "He does that," she said, with the easy acceptance of someone describing a recurring weather pattern. "He helped Mr. Okafor last month when his van broke down, and the Hendersons before that." "Emma," Logan said, without any particular sharpness. "Homework." Emma grabbed her backpack and disappeared into what appeared to be a small office at the back of the workshop, and Sienna was left with the distinct impression that she was in the presence of a 9-year-old who had her act more together than most adults Sienna knew. She didn't leave that evening. She told herself she was waiting for the car to fully stabilize. Logan had mentioned something about letting the new battery charge properly before doing a long drive, but that wasn't really it. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. She didn't want to go back to sitting in the car alone. Logan didn't push her out. He didn't invite her to stay either. He just kept working, running a long piece of cherry through the bandsaw, sanding a cabinet door with long, even strokes, the kind of work that has a rhythm and doesn't require conversation. And she sat on the bench and didn't feel the need to fill the silence, which was its own kind of relief. Around 6 o'clock, Emma came out of the office and said she was hungry. "There's soup on the stove," Logan said. "There's always soup on the stove," Emma said, which seemed to function simultaneously as a complaint and a comfort. Logan wiped sawdust from his hands on a shop rag, looked at Sienna, looked away, looked back. "You're welcome to eat," he said. It wasn't enthusiastic. It wasn't reluctant. It was just an honest offer extended to a person who looked like they needed it. "I don't want to—" "It's vegetable soup," he said. "I made too much." Sienna ate vegetable soup at a small kitchen table in the apartment above the workshop, across from a 9-year-old who told her in precise and increasingly impressive detail about a history project on the Blue Ridge Parkway, while outside the November dark came down hard and the temperature fell below freezing. The soup was good. Imperfect. Slightly over-seasoned, the carrots a little mushy. But good. She didn't tell him who she was. He didn't ask. Juan. It was Emma who changed everything, and she did it without knowing it. They were finishing dinner when Emma got up from the table and went to her room. Sienna had gathered by now that the apartment was small but organized, the kind of space where everything had a specific place because there wasn't room for disorder, and came back carrying a piece of paper. Not new paper. Old paper, slightly creased, the kind that had been folded and unfolded more than once. A child's drawing, done in colored pencil, of what appeared to be a hotel lobby, high ceilings, a curved staircase, oversized floral arrangements. In the corner, in the labored but earnest handwriting of a much younger child, the nice lady who helped us. Emma put it on the table in front of Sienna. "I kept it because I was going to find you someday and give it back," Emma said. "I made it after that night. I don't remember everything, but I remember you, and I remember the room had a window that looked out at the rain." Sienna looked at the drawing. Then she looked at Logan. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between careful and wondering, like a man who has been carrying a story for a long time and has just realized he's in the room with someone who was in it. "The train station," he said quietly. 5 years ago. Greenville, South Carolina. It was the storm, Sienna said. It came back to her slowly, the way things come back that were never recorded anywhere, only felt. A terrible winter storm, a stranded Amtrak, a station hotel charging $300 a night for their last available room. She'd been traveling alone, returning from a resort site inspection, and she'd noticed a man in the lobby, youngish, clearly exhausted, a little girl asleep across his lap, speaking in a low, strained voice to the front desk clerk and watching his face fall as the clerk explained the room rate. She hadn't thought about it much. She'd just gone to the desk after he stepped away and given the clerk her card and said to put the room on it and not to make a big thing about it. She'd left early the next morning. She'd forgotten about it within a week. She was 3, Logan said. Emma, she had a fever. We'd been in the station for 6 hours and I didn't have the money for the room and I was trying to figure out where we were going to go, and then he stopped, started again. The clerk came up to me and said the room was taken care of. I never saw who did it. I had my ideas, but, well. He looked down at the table for a second, then back up at her. It was you. It was nothing, Sienna said automatically. It was everything, Emma said, with absolute clear-eyed certainty. Daddy said so. The silence that followed was the kind you don't rush, Chutsen. Later, Sienna would try to pinpoint the moment when the shape of things started to shift, when the story she was inside of began to change from a story about losing everything to something with a different structure, a different destination. She'd trace it back to that kitchen table, that drawing, that 9-year-old's direct and unsentimental. It was everything. But before any of that could happen, she had to get through the night first, and the night had more to say. Buzz. Her phone buzzed at 9:30 while she was sitting in the car. She'd decided to sleep in the spot Logan had pointed out behind the workshop, which was indeed private and dark and warmer out of the wind. The buzz was not a text. It was a notification from a Google alert she'd set up months ago, back when she was still trying to manage her public narrative, set to track mentions of her name. She'd forgotten it was active. The alert was for a business news article published 40 minutes ago. The headline was, Ashford Hospitality Group cooperates with fraud investigation as former CEO faces growing legal scrutiny. She wasn't named as a suspect. Not technically. But the language was careful in the particular way of articles written by journalists who had been briefed by someone with an agenda. Questions remain about the authorization of transfers. Sources close to the investigation indicate former CEO's access to key accounts. It was constructed to imply without stating, to let readers draw a conclusion while giving the writer legal cover. Her hand was shaking slightly when she put the phone down. Richard had money, lawyers, and a long head start. He'd been building this story for a year or more, brick by quiet brick, and she hadn't seen it because she'd trusted him. Not completely. She'd never completely trusted Richard, even when she'd married him, because she wasn't naive. But she'd trusted him enough, and enough had been enough to leave her exposed. She thought about the text. EV. She picked the phone back up and stared at it. Then she did something that took more than she expected. She typed a reply. Who are you, and how do you know what Richard did? The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Retired forensic accountant. I worked for your ex-husband's investment company 8 years ago. I left because of what I found. I kept copies of everything. I've been waiting for the right moment and the right person. I think that's you. Can we meet? Sienna read it 3 times. Outside the workshop window, a single light was still on. Logan, working late, the shadow of him moving against the frosted glass in the slow, deliberate patterns of someone who makes things carefully and doesn't hurry about it. She looked at the light for a long moment. Then she typed, yes. She didn't sleep much that second night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness. Not the numb, signal-dead emptiness of the nights before. This was something else, a low, crackling thing, like a fire that's just been given dry wood. Dangerous, maybe. Possibly foolish. But alive. She had $2,340 in cash, and a dead company, and a name she couldn't say in public without it meaning something she hadn't done. She was sleeping in a borrowed car behind a woodworking shop in a mountain city she'd never planned to visit, and she was probably being set up for a fraud conviction by a man she'd been married to for 4 years and who she suspected had been planning this exit long before she'd known to be afraid. But she also had a flash drive full of financial documents. She had a text from a woman who'd kept copies of something. And she was apparently not as alone as she'd thought. The light in the workshop window stayed on until almost midnight. She watched it without meaning to, the way you watch a lighthouse when you're not sure yet if you're going to need it. Then it went out. And Sienna Ashford, former billionaire, current resident of a borrowed Volvo, closed her eyes and let herself, for the first time in 3 weeks, feel something that wasn't fear. It wasn't hope yet. It was something smaller than hope and more stubborn. It was the first true thing she'd felt in longer than she wanted to admit. The morning arrived without ceremony. No alarm, no gradual brightening, just the sudden hard gray of a November dawn pressing through the car windows, and the sound of a delivery truck somewhere down the alley reversing with that rhythmic mechanical beeping that drills through sleep like a dentist's tool. Sienna came awake with her neck stiff and her left foot asleep and a crick in her lower back that radiated upward in a way that promised to ruin the first hour of the day. She lay still for a moment, oriented herself. The alley, the wooden fence, the back wall of Mercer Woodworks with its single security light still burning pale against the dawn. And then she remembered the text. Yes, she'd sent it, and then she'd fallen asleep, and now it was morning, and the reality of what she'd agreed to was waiting for her with the particular patience of things you can't unsay. She picked up her phone. The battery was at 11%. She'd been charging it from the car's USB port in short intervals all night, a losing battle. Eleanor Vaughn had replied at 12:04 a.m. Good, I'm in Asheville. I'll come to you. Send me a location when you're ready. I want to see the documents you have before we talk. Photograph everything you brought and send it to this number. Encrypted app preferred. I'll wait. Sienna read it twice. The text had the clipped, no-nonsense quality of someone who had spent years writing reports for people who charged by the hour. Someone who'd learned to say exactly what needed saying and nothing extra. She didn't know whether to trust it. She didn't know whether she had the luxury of not trusting it. She plugged the phone back into the charger and got out of the car to find a bathroom. The workshop's side door was unlocked. She'd noticed that last night. Logan didn't bolt it, just pulled it shut. Whether that was carelessness or a deliberate kind of faith, she couldn't tell. She pushed it open carefully, half expecting to trigger something, and stepped into the dim workshop. The wood smell hit her immediately, that warm, complicated smell of cut lumber and linseed oil and sawdust that had settled into every surface. It was 6:40 in the morning and the shop was empty, the machines standing quiet under their dust covers, shafts of pale light coming in through the high windows and landing on half-finished cabinet doors and stacked timber. She found the bathroom at the back, used it, washed her face in cold water, and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink for probably longer than was healthy. She looked tired. Not the photogenic kind of tired that press people sometimes described as intense or driven. Just genuinely, uncomplicatedly exhausted, the kind that lives under the eyes and makes your skin look like it belongs to a slightly older version of you. Her hair was doing something complicated that she didn't have the tools or the energy to address. She had on the same clothes she'd been wearing since the day before yesterday. She turned off the light and went back through the workshop. Logan was standing at the foot of the wooden stairs that led up to the apartment, holding a mug in each hand. He was already dressed, work clothes, same canvas jacket, and he looked at her without surprise, which suggested either he'd heard her come in or he'd expected she might. "Coffee," he said, extending one of the mugs. "You have to stop doing that," she said. "Probably," he agreed, and didn't stop. She took the mug. It was the same machine as yesterday, the same aggressively strong output, and she wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth travel up her arms. "Emma's getting ready for school," Logan said. "She wants to talk to you before she leaves. You don't have to. It's fine," Sienna said. "I want to." He nodded once and went back upstairs. She followed him because standing alone in the workshop felt stranger than following, and because the coffee was upstairs and she needed to stay close to it. The apartment kitchen looked different in the morning, less strange, more lived in. A child's drawing stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a mountain, a dish rack with 2 plates and a bowl drying beside the sink, a small pot of something on the stove that smelled like oatmeal and meant that Logan had been up long enough to make breakfast before she'd gotten there. Emma's backpack was on the table, unzipped, with a folder sticking out that had Blue Ridge Project written on it in careful block letters. Emma herself appeared from the hallway in a green sweater and jeans, her hair in two uneven braids that she'd clearly done herself, and she stopped when she saw Sienna standing in the kitchen and said, "Good, you're still here." "I'm still here," Sienna said. Emma went to the table and started reorganizing her backpack with the focused urgency of a child running 4 minutes behind. "I was thinking about it last night," she said, not looking up. "The drawing. I was worried you'd think it was weird that I kept it." "I don't think it's weird. Daddy said it was fine, but he also says a lot of things are fine." Emma glanced up briefly. "Did you really not remember us?" The directness of it landed squarely. No softening, no preamble, just the question. "I remembered the storm," Sienna said carefully. "I remembered the station. I didn't remember the details. I'm sorry." Emma seemed to consider whether this was acceptable. She zipped up the backpack and slung it over one shoulder. "It's okay," she said finally. "You probably help a lot of people. You can't remember all of them." A pause. "I remember all the people who've been nice to us." "There's not that many." Logan said, "Emma," quietly, not as a correction but as a kind of gentle marker, the way you'd place a hand on someone's shoulder. Emma looked at him. "Well, it's true." "I know it is." The school bus horn sounded twice from the street, and Emma was out the door before Sienna could say anything else, the backpack pins chiming as she went. Logan watched her go through the kitchen window, the way parents do. That particular sustained attention that doesn't look like anything from the outside, but is everything. Then he turned back to Sienna and said, "She's right. You can't remember all of them. Don't carry it." "I'm not carrying it," Sienna said. I wish I'd paid more attention. At the time. At the time, you just did a good thing and moved on. That's how good things are supposed to work." He picked up his own mug. "Not everything needs to be held on to." She thought about that. There was something deliberately unperformative about the way he said it that made it harder to dismiss than it would have been if he'd said it with more weight. It wasn't wisdom delivered from a height. It was just a thing he believed, stated plainly, take it or leave it. She took it and set it somewhere in the back of her mind and moved on. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. Do you have a secure Wi-Fi, password protected, not a public network?" Logan looked mildly puzzled. "The shop has its own network. I pay for the business tier because the design files are large. Why?" "I need to send some documents, encrypted. It matters that the network is secure." She paused. "I can explain, but it'll take a while." He studied her for a moment, not calculating, just looking, the way he probably looked at a piece of timber he was trying to understand before he touched it. "Workshop computers on the same network," he said. "You can use it. I'll write down the password." She waited for him to ask more. He didn't. He went to the small whiteboard on the kitchen wall where a list of lumber measurements was written, erased a corner of it, and wrote down a network name and a 16-character password. Tore off a corner of a notepad and wrote it again on paper and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said, and she was doing that thing again where she meant it in layers. He went downstairs to open the shop. She stayed at the kitchen table for another minute, her hands around the mug, watching the window. The mountain was visible from here, the near ridge gone dark green and brown with late autumn, the sky above it still doing that undecided gray thing. She thought about Eleanor Vaughn, waiting in Asheville with a file she'd kept for 8 years. She thought about the flash drive in her coat pocket. She thought about Richard, who was probably, right now, in his office in Charlotte, or at a breakfast meeting with the people who were helping him build the story that buried her, doing it with the particular smooth efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this. She finished the coffee and went downstairs. The next 2 hours were careful, deliberate work. She photographed every document on the flash drive using the workshop computer's scanner, 47 pages, some clean and some barely legible, printouts of wire transfer records and LLC registration filings, and one email thread she'd almost missed in her 3 a.m. download session that she now, reading it again in the flat morning light, recognized as important in a way that made her stomach tighten. The email thread was between 2 addresses she didn't recognize, but one of them contained a domain she did. A shell company Richard had mentioned once, casually, in a way that had been designed to seem like a throwaway detail. She compressed the files, ran them through the encrypted messaging app Eleanor had specified, and sent them in 3 batches. Eleanor acknowledged receipt of each batch within minutes. Fast responses. She'd been awake and waiting. At 9:45, while Sienna was at the workshop computer and Logan was at the planer 20 feet away running a long piece of oak through it. With the slow patience of a man who'd learned not to rush machinery, her phone rang. Not a text. A call. Unknown number, but an Asheville area code. She answered. Ms. Ashford. The voice was a woman's, older, unhurried. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. The voice of someone who has been professionally precise for so long it's become a personality. I've looked through what you sent. We need to meet today. Not tomorrow. Today. What did you find? More than I expected, and I came in expecting a great deal. A brief pause. Where are you? Sienna looked across the workshop. Logan had turned off the planer and was examining the edge of the board with his thumb, frowning at something only he could see. She gave Eleanor the address. Another pause, shorter. I'll be there in an hour. The call ended. Logan looked up. He'd heard at least the last part of it, the address, and the fact that someone was coming. Someone's coming here, he said. Not accusatory, just clarifying. A woman named Eleanor Vaughn. Sienna stopped. Considered how much to say. Considered the fact that she was in this man's workspace, using his internet, eating his soup, sleeping behind his building. Considered the fact that he had not once, in 36 hours, asked her a single intrusive question. She has information about the people who are trying to destroy me, she said. Financially, legally. I need to hear what she knows. Logan set the board down. And you trust her? I don't know yet. He thought about that for a second. You want me to stay or go? She hadn't expected the question. What? If you need privacy, I can take the delivery run I've been putting off. If you want someone else in the room, I can stay and look busy. He shrugged slightly. Either way. She thought about it. Stay, she said. If you're willing, you don't need to be involved. I just don't want to be alone in a room with someone I've never met. Logan nodded and turned the planer back on. That was apparently the end of the discussion. Eleanor Vaughn arrived at 10:50, which was early for an hour's notice, which told Sienna something about her urgency. She was 63 or 64, Sienna estimated. Compact, gray-haired, wearing a sensible waterproof jacket over a dark turtleneck, carrying a leather briefcase that had taken a decade of hard use and didn't apologize for it. She looked like someone's grandmother. If that grandmother had spent a career forensically dismantling financial fraud operations and had permanently lost patience with people who expected her to make her findings more palatable. She walked into the workshop, looked around, looked at Logan at his planer without apparent concern, and found Sienna. You look worse than your photos, she said. Thank you, Sienna said flatly. Those are 2 years old. I know. Eleanor set the briefcase on the workbench Sienna had cleared and opened it. Sit down. This is going to take a while. It took an hour and 40 minutes. Eleanor had a system. The briefcase contained physical files organized with an archivist's precision, and she laid them out in a specific sequence that built the picture in layers, the way you might assemble a forensic argument for a jury. She explained things once, clearly, without patronizing, and if Sienna needed her to go back, she went back without making it a thing. What she laid out was this. 8 years ago, Eleanor had been contracted as an external auditor for a private investment firm called Varden Capital Group, which had minority ownership positions in several hospitality companies across the Southeast. One of those companies was a holding entity that, at the time, owned 3 properties, one of which, through a chain of 3 subsidiary LLCs, had a 20% stake in what would eventually become the original core of Ashford Hospitality Group, Sienna's company, her company, before she'd known Richard Ashford existed. He didn't come into my life until, she started. Until you'd already built something worth taking, Eleanor said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Yes, I know the timeline. He met you at the Charleston Industry Conference 4 years before the merger. That wasn't an accident. Varden Capital had been tracking the growth of your properties for 2 years before that. The room felt slightly different after that sentence. Logan had turned off the planer at some point in the last 20 minutes and was sanding something at a bench near the far wall, his back to them, present but not intruding. Sienna said carefully, "He targeted me. His investment group identified you as a high-yield acquisition target, and he executed a personal approach. That's how I'd write it in a report." Eleanor paused. "I'm sorry. I know that's not easy to hear." It wasn't easy to hear. Sienna sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle. Not the shock of it, because somewhere under the numbness of the past 3 weeks, she'd already started to suspect this, but the confirmation of it, the clean, hard-edged fact of it. "The signatures," she said. "The forged transfers. That's where the documents you sent become very important." Eleanor opened a different section of the briefcase and produced a printed comparison sheet. Sienna's actual signature from known authenticated documents on the left, the signatures from the contested transfer authorizations on the right. "These are good forgeries, expensive. Whoever did this had access to multiple samples of your signature from different time periods and used them to develop a composite model. This is not something a person does in a week. This took planning." "How long?" Eleanor met her eyes. "At minimum, 18 months of preparation, possibly longer." Sienna thought about 18 months ago. What she'd been doing. A resort acquisition in Portugal that had taken most of her attention for 6 months. A renovation project in Tennessee. A period where she'd been traveling constantly and Richard had been managing the day-to-day of the Charlotte office, because they'd agreed it made sense, because she'd been stretched too thin to be in 2 places, because she'd trusted him enough. Enough. "What do you have?" she said. "From 8 years ago. What did you find that made you leave?" Eleanor's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. A very slight tightening, the kind you only catch if you're watching for it. "I found evidence that Varden Capital was using its hospitality subsidiaries to move money. Not large amounts. Not at first. Small transfers, consistent, routed through enough layers that it looked like ordinary operational cash flow. I flagged it in my report. 2 weeks later, my contract was terminated and the report was classified as confidential." She paused. "I made copies of everything before I handed over my files. I've been waiting for a moment when those copies could be used rather than buried." "Why me? Why now?" "Because now they've gotten greedy," Eleanor said simply. "What they did to you is bigger than anything they attempted before. It's provable. And because—" She stopped, looked at the briefcase for a moment, then back up. "Because when my contract was terminated, the man who called me to deliver the news was Richard Ashford. He was 29 years old and he had the manner of someone who had never once believed he would face consequences." A pause. "I've thought about him a great deal over the past 8 years. The workshop was quiet for a moment except for the distant sound of traffic and the faint, even rhythm of Logan's sandpaper against wood. Sienna said, "What do we do with it?" "The documents you have, combined with what I've kept, it's a strong foundation, but it needs to be put in front of the right people. Specifically, a federal forensic accounting team, not a civil attorney. What Richard is doing is wire fraud, securities fraud, and potentially money laundering. Those are federal offenses." Eleanor began reorganizing the briefcase with efficient, practiced movements. "The problem is that Richard has a long relationship with several people who would ordinarily be among the first to receive a complaint of this kind. We need to be careful about who we approach first." "Do you know who we can trust?" "I know one person," Eleanor said. "A federal financial crimes investigator I worked with 15 years ago. He's retired now, but he has the contacts and the credibility to get this in front of the right office without it being intercepted." She looked up. "He's going to want to verify my credentials and yours. This will take time, and during that time, Richard is going to keep moving. He'll try to accelerate the narrative against you, more press leaks, possibly a civil filing." "I have nowhere to stay," Sienna said. She'd been holding it back, but there it was. "My accounts are frozen. I can't use my name at a hotel without it being searchable. I have cash for maybe 10 days and use the cabin." Both women looked up. Logan was standing at his workbench, his back still mostly turned, sandpaper in one hand. He hadn't turned around when he spoke. He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without making it bigger than it was. "What?" Sienna said. He turned around then, leaned against the bench. I have a cabin on the back half of the property, up the slope, past the tree line. I use it for storage right now, but it's got heat and running water and a lock on the door. He was looking at Sienna directly, not at Eleanor. You need a place to work from that's not a car. The cabin's empty. You can use it. That's... Sienna started. I can't let you pay me, he said, heading off the objection, because I know your accounts are frozen and I'm not going to take your last cash. But I could use someone to go through the shop's financial records. They're a mess. I've been putting it off for 8 months because I hate doing it. A slight pause, the ghost of something almost self-deprecating. That'd be a fair trade, if you're looking for one. Sienna looked at him. He was not. She was certain of this, saying this to be generous in a way that could be called back later. He was saying it because it was a practical solution to a practical problem, and because he'd apparently decided, at some point in the last 36 hours, to extend her a degree of trust that she hadn't earned and wasn't sure she knew how to carry. Why? She said, the same word she'd said to him the first time when he'd brought her coffee. He seemed to remember it too. Same reason as before, he said. Eleanor watched this exchange with the particular expression of someone who is categorizing information efficiently and not commenting on it. The cabin, Sienna said finally. Okay, yes, thank you. Logan nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his sanding. Eleanor closed the briefcase. The arrangement had none of the formality of contracts or the comfort of familiarity. It was just 3 people in a woodworking shop making a decision at 10:50 in the morning in November because the situation required it. That was all it was. That was enough. The cabin turned out to be a 20-minute walk up a gravel path through second-growth hardwood forest, and it was the kind of place that had last been properly maintained about 4 years ago and had done its waiting patiently in the meantime. One main room, a small kitchen corner, a bathroom with water pressure that had opinions, a cast-iron stove that Logan came up with Emma that first evening to light, because the flue needed to be cleared before it was safe to use, and that was apparently something he knew how to do in a matter of 20 minutes with a wire brush on a long handle and a flashlight held in his mouth. Emma stood at the door of the cabin watching him work and told Sienna in a conversational tone that her dad had fixed the same stove 3 times, and it always needed to be cleared in the fall, and he always acted surprised about it. I can hear you, Logan said, voice muffled by the fact that half of his upper body was inside the fireplace. I know, Emma said. Sienna sat on the cabin's one chair, wooden, sturdy, slightly lopsided, and watched the two of them with something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't envy exactly. It was more like recognizing something she'd never had and not having the right word for it yet. That first night in the cabin, with the cast-iron stove knocking and creaking as it warmed up for the first time in months, Sienna sat at the small table with her laptop open and started going through Logan's financial records. He'd warned her they were a mess. He hadn't been underselling it. 3 years of invoices, material costs, client billing, subcontractor payments, tax filings, and equipment costs lived in a combination of a basic accounting software, a folder of scanned receipts, a physical binder he'd labeled important that contained things of varying degrees of importance, and what appeared to be a napkin with a calculation on it that she found tucked into the binder and spent a full minute staring at before deciding it was probably a bid estimate from sometime last spring. It was a disaster. It was also beneath the chaos of fundamentally solid business, good margins, steady clients, material costs that were disciplined even when the record-keeping wasn't. Logan knew what things cost. He just didn't know how to make that legible to anyone who hadn't been in his head. She worked until 2 in the morning. Old habit. She'd always done her best financial thinking late, when the noise of the day cleared out and the numbers could be what they were without people talking over them. When she finally closed the laptop, the stove had settled into a steady, even warmth, and outside the cabin windows, the mountain dark was absolute and silent, in the way that mountain dark is. No city glow, no traffic, nothing but the kind of quiet you have to let your ears adjust to before you can hear the things inside it. She hadn't felt safe in 3 weeks. She wasn't sure she felt safe now, exactly. Eleanor's caution was well-founded. Richard was still out there building his story. The documents still needed to be authenticated. The federal contacts still needed to be made. The threat hadn't gone anywhere. It was just, for the moment, at a distance. She sat with the stove's warmth and thought about a 9-year-old on a train platform 5 years ago, feverish and asleep across her father's lap, and a drawing done in colored pencil of a lobby she'd only been in twice. She thought about the specific persistence of a child who decides that a kindness matters and keeps the evidence of it, folded and refolded, in a room somewhere, against the day when she can return it. She thought about the way things travel, how an act done without attention, without expectation, without even the intention of being remembered, can move through time and arrive somewhere completely unexpected, carrying a weight you never meant to give it. She wasn't sure what any of it meant yet. She wasn't sure she needed to be. She added the napkin calculation to the binder in what seemed like the right section and went to bed. The next morning, she woke up with the particular groggy clarity that comes after the first real sleep you've had in too long. And the first thing she heard was Emma's voice below the cabin window, talking to someone. Herself, probably, or possibly a squirrel she'd apparently named Gerald, and was engaged in a complex ongoing negotiation with regarding jurisdiction over the path to the workshop. Sienna lay there for a few minutes, listening to Emma argue with Gerald about property rights, and felt, slowly and without ceremony, the signal come back in. Not all of it. Not the whole frequency. But enough. 3 days into the cabin, Sienna found the first anomaly at 11:40 at night. She almost missed it. She'd been working through Logan's shop records, the legitimate ones, the ones he'd asked her to organize, when out of habit she opened one of the folders on her flash drive, the ones she'd downloaded in that frantic pre-dawn session back in Charlotte. She'd been through most of them already, flagging things for Eleanor, but there was one subfolder she'd labeled MISC, check later, in her initial triage, back when she'd been moving too fast to look closely at everything. She opened it now, half her attention still on Logan's invoices, half on the cold coffee going stale at her elbow. The subfolder contained 31 files. The 23rd file stopped her cold. It was a wire transfer authorization. On its face, unremarkable. She'd seen hundreds of these over the years running Ashford Hospitality Group. Transfer amount, $412,000. Date, 19 months ago. Originating account. A cash reserve account she maintained for property acquisition deposits, one she used infrequently and monitored loosely because the balance rarely moved. Destination, an LLC she didn't recognize. Callaway Development Partners. Her signature was in the authorization field. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled up her authenticated signature from a known document, her driver's license renewal from 2 years ago, which she'd had the presence of mind to photograph before she left Charlotte, and held them side by side on the screen. The signatures were similar, very similar, but the authenticated one had a particular habit in the tail of the capital A in Ashford, a slight leftward curl she'd developed in college and never shaken, that was subtly wrong in the transfer authorization. Not obviously wrong. Wrong enough that you'd need to know what you were looking for. She opened the next file. Different amount, different date, different destination, LLC, same signature, same subtly wrong A. Then the next. Then the next. By the time she'd been through all 31 files, her hands were not steady. $11 million. That was the number Richard's lawyer had cited in the conference room. But going through these 31 files, adding amounts on the notepad she'd grabbed from beside the stove, she was looking at $14.3 million. And these were only the files she'd managed to pull before her access was cut. There could be more. There almost certainly were more. She stared at the total on the notepad for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and texted Eleanor. "I need you tomorrow morning, early. I found more and it's worse than we thought." Eleanor replied in 4 minutes, which for midnight was impressively fast. 7 a.m. I'll bring the comparison files. Sienna put the phone down and looked at the wall of the cabin. Rough-cut pine boards, a few old nails where pictures had once hung, a water stain in the upper corner that had been there long enough to become part of the room's character. The stove had burned down to embers, and the room had gone from warm to merely not cold. She should have added wood an hour ago. She got up and added 2 logs and stood there watching the embers catch them, the slow, reluctant orange spreading under the bark. And she tried to organize what she was feeling into something manageable. $14.3 million. Taken over what appeared to be a period of at least 22 months, in amounts small enough and from accounts obscure enough that they could move through an audit without triggering standard review. Authorized with her signature. Signed, she was now certain, by someone who had practiced her handwriting with the patience and discipline of a person playing a very long game. She had married Richard Ashford 4 years ago at a small ceremony in Charleston with 12 guests and a cake that had been the wrong flavor because she'd been too distracted by a property negotiation to finalize the order in time. She had told herself at the time that the wrong cake was a good sign, evidence that she wasn't the kind of person who got lost in the performance of things at the expense of the substance of them. She'd thought that made her practical. She understood now that it had also made her easy, not stupid. She was not stupid, and she had never been stupid, and she refused, even in the privacy of her own head at midnight in a mountain cabin, to frame it that way. But she had been focused. She had been looking in one direction, at the growth of the company, the next acquisition, the next market. And Richard had used that focus against her the way you use someone's momentum against them, the way a very specific kind of person learns to do. She'd been easy because she'd been busy. She went back to the table, opened a new document, started writing down everything she'd found, in order, with file names and amounts and dates, in the methodical way Eleanor had shown her. Build the record, assume you'll need to explain it to someone who knows nothing, leave nothing ambiguous. She worked until 4 a.m. When she finally stopped, she had 9 pages of notes and the beginning of something that felt, for the first time since Charlotte, like solid ground. Eleanor arrived at the cabin at 6:50, 10 minutes early, carrying her briefcase and a paper bag from a bakery that Sienna hadn't known was open this early. "I couldn't sleep either," Eleanor said, setting the bag on the table and opening it. There were 2 almond croissants inside, one of which had been slightly crushed by the briefcase in transit. Eleanor handed Sienna the less crushed one without comment. They worked through the morning together at the small table, the cabin filling with the kind of focused quiet that comes when 2 people are doing serious work and both know it. Eleanor had brought her own comparison documents, the transfer records from 8 years ago, the ones she'd taken when she left Varden Capital. And the more they laid out side by side with what Sienna had found, the more clearly the architecture of it emerged. He ran the same operation twice, Eleanor said, around 9 o'clock. She had a pencil behind her ear and her reading glasses halfway down her nose, and she was looking at the 2 sets of documents with the detached intensity of someone who has spent 40 years learning to read money the way other people read text. 8 years ago, the amounts were smaller. It was a learning exercise, essentially. He moved money through the Varden Hospitality subsidiaries, built the technical infrastructure for it, the shell company network, the forged authorization system, and then stopped when I started asking questions. He waited, improved the method, and then he found a much larger vehicle. Me, Sienna said. Your company, Eleanor said. Precise. He spent years building the access, the relationship, the marriage, the gradual positioning of himself in operational roles that gave him access to the authorization accounts. She removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. This is a sophisticated long-form fraud scheme. This is not something he improvised. Every step was designed. The word designed sat between them for a moment. How do I prove the signatures are forged? Sienna said. To a court, to federal investigators, not just to us. Forensic document examination, Eleanor said, replacing her glasses. A qualified FDE can analyze the pen pressure, stroke sequence, and microstructure of the signatures. The forgeries are good, but good is not the same as perfect, particularly against a body of authenticated samples. We need at least 30 known authenticated signatures for comparison. The more diverse the samples in terms of context and time period, the stronger the analysis. I have my passport, my driver's license, and about 40 pages of documents I've personally signed over the years that I pulled from my own files. That may be enough to start. Eleanor made a note. The other piece is the LLC network, Callaway Development Partners, the other entities. If we can trace them back to Richard or to Varden Capital, the structural fraud becomes provable independent of the signature question. That's where your documents and mine overlap most significantly. She tapped a section of the comparison layout. This LLC, Callaway, appears in my 8-year-old records as a dormant entity registered in Delaware. It was inactive when I flagged it. The fact that it's now receiving transfers from your accounts means it was reactivated. Reactivation leaves a registration trail. Can you follow it? Eleanor looked at her over the glasses. I've been following paper trails for 40 years. Yes. By 11 o'clock, they had a working document that organized the evidence into 4 categories: the forged signature analysis, the LLC network structure, the timeline of transfers relative to Richard's operational access, and the historical pattern from 8 years ago that established prior intent and methodology. It was incomplete. There were gaps, things that needed verification, threads that led to dead ends that would need to be approached from a different angle. But it was coherent. It held together. I need to contact my federal connection, Eleanor said, closing her briefcase with the precise finality of someone completing a phase. Before I do, I need to be certain about one thing. She looked at Sienna. When this goes federal, it will move fast and it will be public. You won't be able to control the narrative. The story will get bigger before it gets clearer. And in the window between those two things, Richard's people will push hard on the version that implicates you. You need to be prepared for that. I've already been through the worst of the public version, Sienna said. There's not much left to take from me in terms of reputation. There's always more they can take, Eleanor said, not unkindly. I'm not saying don't do this. I'm saying do it with your eyes open. They're open. Eleanor studied her for a moment, apparently satisfied. Good. I'll make the call today. She left at 11:30, back down the gravel path through the hardwoods to the road where her car was parked. Sienna stood in the cabin doorway and watched her go, and then stood there a few minutes longer, breathing cold November air, before going back inside to finish the notes. She was deep in the documentation, cross-referencing transfer dates against a calendar of Richard's travels she'd reconstructed from a combination of memory and email fragments she'd saved, when the knock came at the cabin door at 2 in the afternoon. It was Logan. He had a thermos of coffee and a look on his face that said he'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it, which was apparently how he operated. He didn't speak impulsively. He arrived at things and then said them. Can I come in for a minute? She stepped back from the doorway. He came in, looked at the table covered in documents and notes and the laptop with 4 windows open, and didn't comment on any of it. He set the thermos on the kitchen counter and put his hands in his jacket pockets. I need to tell you something, he said. And I want to say first that it doesn't change anything about what we've already agreed to. The cabin, the records, all of that stands regardless. Sienna turned her chair to face him. Okay. He looked at the window for a second, then back at her. My situation isn't exactly what it looks like, he said. The shop, the apartment, I've let people assume things, and I haven't corrected them, and that feels wrong to me now, given what you're dealing with. What do you mean? He took a breath. Not a dramatic one. More like a man who is getting ready to say something that he's been leaving unsaid for long enough that it's acquired weight. My mother's family had money. Old money. Not the kind that gets talked about, the kind that gets managed. My grandfather set up a family trust before he died. I'm the primary beneficiary. He paused. It's substantial. Sienna waited. I don't use it, he said. I built the shop from scratch, worked the tools myself from the start. I didn't want to do it any other way. Emma doesn't know the extent of it. She knows we have some family money, but not the numbers. He looked faintly uncomfortable in the way of a person who grew up understanding that talking about money directly was something other people did. The trust is managed by a firm out of Charlotte. I don't have much to do with the day-to-day management. I take a distribution once a year that I mostly put back in. But the firm has recently flagged something in the portfolio that I've been ignoring because I didn't want to deal with it. He went to the counter, picked up the thermos, set it back down. A small, restless movement. There's a minority equity position in an investment group, he said, part of the trust portfolio. A holding I inherited, not something I chose. The management firm has been telling me for 2 years to either consolidate it or activate the shareholder rights attached to it, because the position is large enough that I'm entitled to significant oversight access. He looked at her directly. The investment group is called Varden Capital. The cabin was very quiet. Sienna sat with the name hanging in the air between them and felt the particular sensation of 2 separate stories suddenly occupying the same space, The hair on the back of your neck recognition that things which seemed unconnected have been connected all along, just out of your line of sight. "How large is the position?" she said, and she heard her voice come out very even, which was impressive given what her chest was doing. "I don't know the exact current valuation. When I last looked seriously at the trust documents, 2 years ago, when the management firm was pushing me to deal with it, the position was valued at somewhere between 40 and 60 million. And the shareholder rights, entitled to financial audit access, board observer status, and this is the part the management firm kept emphasizing, the right to call an independent audit of the fund's financial operations if there's cause to believe mismanagement." He paused. "I didn't know any of this was relevant to anything until you started talking to that woman this morning. I could hear some of it from the workshop, not the details, the names. Varden Capital came up twice." Sienna looked at him. He met her eyes steadily. "I looked up the trust documents this afternoon," he said, "while you were working. I haven't opened that binder in 22 months, and I needed to check." He put his hand in the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, set it on the table beside her laptop. "That's the relevant section. Shareholder rights, audit provisions. The management firm's contact is at the bottom. They've been waiting for me to tell them what to do with it for 2 years. A slight dry pause. "I've been busy with the walnut." Sienna unfolded the paper and read it. Twice. She was very good at reading legal and financial language. She'd had to become good at it early, before she could afford attorneys for everything. And what she was reading was as clear as Eleanor had said it was important. Logan Mercer, as primary beneficiary of the Mercer Family Trust, held a $43 million equity position in Varden Capital Group, and with it the explicit right to demand an independent audit of Varden's financial operations based on reasonable cause to believe financial misconduct. If Eleanor's 8-year-old records constituted reasonable cause, and Sienna was almost certain a federal financial crimes investigator would agree that they did, then Logan could trigger an independent audit that Richard and Varden Capital had no standing to block. They couldn't bury it. They couldn't classify it. They couldn't make it go away. An audit demanded by a major equity holder, supported by a federal investigator, backed by a forensic accountant's documented evidence. That was a different kind of thing entirely from one woman's accusations against her ex-husband. "You understand what this means," she said. It wasn't a question. "I think so," Logan said. "Mostly I understand that someone has been stealing from you for years, and they used a company that my family money has been sitting in without me paying attention." He picked the thermos back up and finally poured coffee into the lid cup and set it in front of her. "I don't have much interest in staying uninvolved after that." "This could get complicated," she said. "For you. Once this moves, legally, your name is going to be attached to it, your trust, your shareholder position. It'll be public eventually." "I know. Emma." He looked at the window. "I know," he said again, differently this time. The weight of a parent calculating risk, which is a different and heavier calculation than any other kind. "But Emma is also the kid who kept a drawing for 5 years to give back to a stranger because she thought it was the right thing to do." A pause. "She'd tell me to help." Sienna looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing romantic in it. She needed to be clear about that, at least in her own head. It wasn't that kind of looking. It was the kind of looking you do when you are trying to understand someone and you realize you've been, without quite meaning to, already trusting them for days. And the question is whether that trust was well placed, or whether you've been so depleted by the betrayal of the person you should have been able to trust most that you've lost your calibration entirely. She didn't think she'd lost her calibration. She thought Logan Mercer was, without trying to be, exactly what he appeared to be. A man who did what he thought was right without making it a performance, who had built a life on his own terms inside the complicated inheritance of family wealth he hadn't chosen and wasn't sure he wanted, who had a 9-year-old daughter who argued with squirrels and did her own braids and got hundreds on her math tests and had decided 5 years ago, with the absolute unambiguous clarity of a child, that a stranger's kindness on a rainy night was worth keeping. "Call your management firm," Sienna said. "Tell them you want to discuss the audit provision. Don't mention specifics yet. Just tell them you have cause and you want to understand the process." She looked at the paper. "Can I show this to Eleanor?" "Yes." "She's going to need it for the federal contact." "Okay." He stood for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. Logan, he stopped. Why didn't you just tell me yesterday? When Eleanor was here, he thought about it. Because yesterday, I wasn't sure I had it right, he said. I needed to look at the actual documents first. I didn't want to tell you something significant and get it wrong. He opened the door. Cold air moved through the cabin. Also, I was finishing the oak piece and I needed to concentrate. He said it with such complete sincerity that she laughed. Actually laughed. A real one. The first one she'd produced in what felt like a very long time. It surprised both of them. He looked mildly pleased by it and went back down the path. She sat with the coffee and the paper and the sound of her own laugh still faintly in the air, and then she called Eleanor. I need you to come back tomorrow, she said when Eleanor answered. I found something that changes the scope of what we can do. How significantly? Sienna looked at the page in her hand. Significantly enough that I think Richard Ashford is done. A pause. I'll be there at 8. She hung up. Looked at the wall of the cabin. The stove was going well today. She'd learned its habits by now. Learned that it needed the larger logs placed at a specific angle, or it ran hot on one side. Learned that the damper had a sweet spot about 2/3 open that kept the burn clean and even. Small practical knowledge, the kind you only get from being somewhere long enough. Outside, the light was going. The mountain ate the afternoon fast, the ridge cutting off the low November sun by 3:30, so that the forest went from amber to gray to dark in less than an hour. She could hear Emma somewhere down the slope, back from the school bus, the intermittent sound of her voice rising up through the trees, probably still negotiating with Gerald. Sienna pulled the laptop toward her and opened a new window. She wanted to look at the Callaway Development Partners LLC registration. Eleanor had mentioned it was registered in Delaware, so Delaware registrations were public record. She went to the state's Division of Corporations database and typed in the name, Callaway Development Partners, LLC. Registered 11 years ago. Status, active. Registered agent, a Delaware incorporation service, the generic kind used by entities that don't want their principals immediately traceable. Member manager, listed as another LLC. She clicked through to that one, also Delaware. Also managed by another entity. 3 layers deep, standard obfuscation architecture. She went back to Callaway's filing history. Registered 11 years ago, went dormant after about 18 months. Consistent with Eleanor's finding. Then a reinstatement filing 6 years ago. She looked at the date of the reinstatement, 3 months before Richard had introduced himself to her at the Charleston Industry Conference. She sat very still. 3 months before he'd walked up to her at a networking dinner and said, with that easy self-assurance she'd found compelling at the time, "You're Sienna Ashford. Your Beaufort property is one of the most architecturally interesting restoration projects in the Southeast. I'd love to know what your expansion plans look like." And she had talked to him for 2 hours because he'd asked good questions and seemed to understand the business. And she'd thought his interest was in the work. She closed the laptop. The fire popped. Outside, Emma's voice had gone quiet, which probably meant she'd gone inside for dinner, and the forest was settling into the nighttime silence that Sienna was beginning to recognize as a presence rather than an absence, something full rather than empty, alive rather than void. She sat in it. She thought about 6 years. 6 years of a plan, patient and precise, moving in the background of a life she'd thought was her own. 6 years of Richard Ashford watching her build something and calculating how to take it, executing the plan with a focus and discipline that, and this was the nauseating part, the part she kept coming back to, mirrored the focus and discipline she applied to her own work. He'd been professional about it. He'd done it the way she'd built her company, carefully, incrementally, without making a single unnecessary move. She thought about what that said about what he'd seen when he looked at her. Not a person, a vehicle, a system to be learned and exploited. She let herself feel the full weight of it, didn't push it away, didn't manage it, just let it sit in her chest and be as heavy as it was. Then she picked up her notepad and wrote down the reinstatement date and what it meant in the methodical way Eleanor had taught her, because the feeling was real and necessary, and also there was work to do. There was a lot of work to do. She worked until the fire died down again, and this time she didn't let it. She got up and added the logs correctly, the angle she'd learned, the damper at 2/3, and went back to the table. The cabin was warm. The documents were organized. Outside, the mountain dark was absolute and cold and full of things going on without her. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she now recognized as belonging to Priya, the young attorney who'd called her 3 weeks ago to warn her. "I heard you have new legal support. I don't want to step on anything, but if you need co-counsel who knows the civil side of what Richard has been building, I want to be in the room. I should have fought harder to stay 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry I didn't." Sienna read it 3 times. She typed back, "I'll be in touch soon. Thank you for the warning. It mattered." She put the phone down. She thought about the email thread she'd found in the MISC folder, the one between the 2 unrecognized addresses, one with the Varden domain. She'd flagged it for Eleanor, but hadn't been through it carefully yet. She pulled it up now. 42 emails spanning 14 months. She started at the beginning and read forward. By the time she reached email 37, she wasn't cold anymore. She wasn't tired. She was angry. Not the frantic, helpless anger of the conference room 3 weeks ago. Not the numb, signal-dead anger of the car. Something different, cleaner. The kind of anger that knows what it is and what it's for. The kind that comes when you have been patient long enough to understand the full shape of what was done to you, and your patience has finally, completely run out. Email 37 was a conversation between Richard and a man referred to only as DH, discussing in careful but unmistakable language the timeline for what they called the transition. The date they expected Sienna to be removed from operational control of Ashford Hospitality Group, the board members they'd already spoken to. The press contacts who could be relied upon to run a particular kind of story on a particular kind of timeline, and one line in Richard's voice that she read 4 times. "She'll fight it, but she doesn't have the architecture to fight it the right way. She builds companies. She doesn't know how to dismantle them. That's the difference between us." She stared at that line for a long time. She builds companies. She doesn't know how to dismantle them. She closed the laptop. She picked up her phone and texted Eleanor again. "There's a 42 email thread you need to see before you call your federal contact. Come at 7, not 8. And bring more croissant." Then she set the phone down and sat back and looked at the ceiling of the cabin. The rough pine boards, the water stain in the corner, the single overhead bulb on a pull chain that she'd been meaning to replace because it was the wrong color temperature for working, and it was giving her a headache by 9 o'clock every night. She builds companies. She doesn't know how to dismantle them. Richard had been wrong about a great many things, but he'd been most wrong about that. Eleanor arrived at 6:52 with croissants and a look on her face that meant she hadn't slept. Sienna had been up since 5. The email thread was printed, all 42 pages, courtesy of the workshop printer Logan had unlocked for her without being asked when she'd knocked on the workshop door at 5:30 and said she needed to print something urgently. He'd handed her the key to the supply room where the printer lived, told her the paper tray stuck on the left side and needed a firm push, and gone back to whatever he'd been doing at that hour, which appeared to involve a cup of coffee and a set of hand-drawn plans spread across the main workbench. She'd printed everything and organized it into sequence and made notes in the margins in the way Eleanor had shown her, clinical, precise, nothing editorial, and by the time Eleanor walked through the cabin door, the table was ready. Eleanor set down the bakery bag, looked at the table, and said, "You didn't sleep." "Some," Sienna said. "How much is some?" "Enough to function." Eleanor sat down, pulled on her reading glasses, and picked up the first page of the email thread. She read in silence. Sienna poured coffee from the thermos she'd brought up from the workshop and set a cup beside Eleanor's elbow and sat across from her and waited. Eleanor read all 42 pages without speaking. She made 2 small marks in pencil. She'd brought her own, she always had one, in the margins of pages 11 and 31. When she finished, she set the stack down and took her glasses off and rubbed her eyes in the way of a person who has looked at too many documents over too many decades and whose eyes have started to have opinions about it. "DH," she said. "I think it's Donovan Hale," Sienna said. "He was Varden Capital's operations director when you were there, you said. He's still with the firm. I checked last night. He's been promoted twice." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Donovan Hale. Yes." She looked at page 11, where her pencil mark was. "This email, where Richard discusses the board members. 2 of them are named by initial only, but the context makes the identification straightforward if you know the board composition." She looked up. "Do you have the board records from the period?" In my flash drive materials. I have them. Get them. They worked through the morning building the structure of it, layering the email thread against the financial documents, against Eleanor's 8-year-old records, against the LLC registration trail. Each piece on its own was significant but potentially dismissible. Assembled in sequence, organized in the way Eleanor assembled things. With the patience of someone who had spent a career explaining financial fraud to people who hadn't known they were looking at it, it became something different. It became a case. At 10:15, Eleanor made the call. She went outside to make it, standing on the narrow porch of the cabin in her waterproof jacket with her phone pressed to her ear, and Sienna watched her through the window. The straight posture, the short, precise sentences, the occasional pause where she listened, the way she nodded twice in quick succession near the end of the call, the way people do when they're hearing something they expected and are moving on from it efficiently. She came back inside after 9 minutes. "His name is Warren Costello," Eleanor said, sitting back down. "He retired from the Financial Crimes Division 4 years ago. He's consulting now, which means he has the relationships and the credibility, but not the bureaucratic constraints." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "He wants to see everything, physical copies, not digital. He's driving up from Raleigh on Friday." "Friday is 3 days." "I know. He moves carefully. It's why I trust him." Eleanor paused. "He also said something I need to pass along, and I need you to hear it clearly." She looked at Sienna directly. "He said that when this opens, when the federal inquiry begins, it will be fast and it will not be contained. Richard will know within hours that something is moving against him, and his first instinct will be to accelerate. He may try to preemptively file civil claims against you. He may attempt to move assets that aren't already frozen. He may try to discredit the investigation before it gets traction." She paused. "Warren believes there's a real possibility Richard will attempt to contact you directly, to negotiate, to make the problem go away before it becomes unmanageable for him." Sienna said nothing for a moment, then, "He won't negotiate with me. He'll threaten me." "Probably," Eleanor agreed, "which is why Warren wants you to be careful this week. Don't go anywhere alone that isn't documented. Don't take calls from unknown numbers without recording capability on. And," she looked mildly uncomfortable saying the next part, "the way people who have spent their careers in data and paper look uncomfortable when things become physical." He asked whether your current location is known to anyone connected to Richard. Sienna thought about it. She'd told no one she was in Asheville except Priya, and Priya had been the one who'd warned her in the first place. The Google Alert article from 3 weeks ago hadn't specified a location. Her phone was in her name, but she'd been careful about what she searched on it. "I don't think so," she said, "but I don't know for certain." Eleanor nodded. "Warren will address the security question when he arrives. Until then, he said to stay put and stay quiet." A slight dry pause. He also said, and I'm quoting him directly, "Tell her not to do anything heroic. He means don't confront anyone and don't leak anything to the press." "I understand." "Do you?" Eleanor's eyebrows moved slightly. "Because you have the kind of face that looks like it's calculating whether the press option might be faster." "It might be faster," Sienna said. "It would also be uncontrolled and give Richard's lawyers something to work with, I know." She met Eleanor's eyes. "I'm not going to do anything stupid." "Good," Eleanor said. "Neither am I, not after 8 years." They worked until noon, finishing the organization of the evidentiary package. At 12:30, Eleanor put the materials in the briefcase. The original documents, the printed emails, the timeline they'd constructed together, all of it labeled and tabbed in Eleanor's system, and stood up. "I'll confirm with Warren tomorrow," she said. "Keep your phone charged." She picked up the briefcase, looked around the cabin once, looked at Sienna. "You've done good work with this. The organization, the cross-referencing. Richard thought you only knew how to build things." She said it without warmth and without coldness, just as a statement of record. He was wrong. Sienna didn't say anything. Eleanor left. The 3 days between Eleanor's morning visit and Warren Costello's arrival were the strangest days of Sienna's time in Asheville, a period of enforced stillness in the middle of something that was, beneath the surface, moving very fast. There was nothing to do but wait, and waiting had never been something she was built for. She finished organizing Logan's financial records. A job that would have taken a bookkeeper a month she completed in 6 days, driven partly by competence and partly by the need to have somewhere to put the restless energy that had nowhere else to go, and printed the organized reports in clean folders that she left on the workshop counter with a summary sheet on top. Logan found them the second morning and came up to the cabin with the folder in his hand and an expression she'd started to recognize as the one he wore when he was processing something that surprised him. "This is," he started. "You had good records underneath the mess," she said. "You just needed them in one place." He looked at the summary sheet. She'd given him 3 years of clean profit and loss, a material cost analysis broken down by project type, a client billing summary that identified 2 accounts that were consistently slow to pay, and one that owed him an amount that had apparently been sitting unpursued for 14 months. 14 months, he said, looking at that line. "You invoiced them. They just never followed up on the second invoice, and you let it sit." She paused. "It's 4,000 and change? It's not nothing." He looked at the number. "I knew they hadn't paid. I didn't want to make it awkward. They're good clients when they pay. Send them a clean invoice with a 30-day notice and a late fee schedule. You're not making it awkward. You're running a business." She watched him absorb this. "You also have a tax filing discrepancy from 2 years ago that your accountant appears to have miscategorized. I flagged it. It's in the red tab." He opened the red tab, read the note she'd left, looked up. "This is significant. It's recoverable, but you should address it with a tax attorney before next filing season." He closed the folder. He had the look of a man who has been handed something he didn't know he needed and is now recalibrating. "This is worth more than the cabin," he said. "The cabin has been very useful," she said. He seemed to want to say something else, and then didn't, and instead went back down the path with the folder, which was its own kind of answer. On the second day of waiting, the threat arrived. Not from Richard directly. She'd half expected that, Eleanor's warning sitting at the back of her mind all week. But what arrived was more impersonal and in some ways more unsettling because of it. It came as a notification, a new court filing in the civil case Richard's attorneys had initiated when her accounts were frozen. The filing contained a new motion, added in the last 48 hours, requesting that the court issue a restraining order preventing Sienna from accessing, sharing, or distributing any business documents from Ashford Hospitality Group on the grounds that she remained under investigation for fraud and document sharing could constitute evidence tampering. She read it twice. It was precisely calibrated, legal enough to be filed, aggressive enough that complying with it, if a judge granted it, would neutralize the evidentiary package before Warren Costello could act on it. She called Eleanor immediately. "I see it," Eleanor said, before Sienna could speak. She'd been watching the case docket. "He's moving faster than Warren predicted. This means someone in his network knows something is in motion." A pause. "Or he's simply being preemptive because it's what he would do regardless. Either way, the filing is real. Yes, I've already called Priya." Sienna stopped. "Priya, you forwarded her message to me 2 days ago. I reached out to her this morning, before this filing appeared. She's sharp, and she knows the civil architecture of this case. She's already drafting a response." Eleanor's voice was steady, with that quality she had of treating urgency as a technical problem to be solved. "The critical point is that federal evidence shared with a federal investigator is not subject to civil evidence tampering provisions. Warren needs to receive the package before that restraining order is granted, which means Friday is no longer soon enough." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. "How soon?" Sienna said. "I'm calling Warren now. Tonight if he can manage it. Tomorrow morning at the absolute latest." Eleanor paused. "Stay at the cabin. Don't move the documents. I'll call you back within the hour." She called back in 40 minutes. Warren Costello was driving up that night. He'd be in Asheville by 10 p.m. Sienna went down to the workshop. Logan was at the bandsaw, cutting curves into what appeared to be chair legs. A batch of 8, all needing to match. He turned off the machine when she came in, which she'd noticed he always did when someone entered, because the saw was loud enough that you couldn't talk over it, and he apparently didn't like conducting conversations in pieces. "Something happened," he said. Not a question. She told him. Not everything. She gave him the shape of it. The restraining order motion, the accelerated timeline, Costello coming tonight. He listened without interrupting, the way he listened to everything, with the full settled attention of a person who has learned that the first thing someone says isn't always the whole of what they need to say. When she finished, he said, "Can they enforce the restraining order before tonight?" Priya says it's unlikely. The motion was filed this afternoon, and a judge would need to grant it at an emergency hearing. It could happen, but it would need to be fast. So the window is tonight. The window is tonight. He looked at the chair legs for a moment, then at her. "You should eat something before Costello gets here. You've been on coffee and anxiety since Tuesday." She almost laughed. "That's what you take from this? You think better when you've eaten," he said, with the certainty of someone who has observed this empirically. "There's pasta on the stove. It's been on low for an hour. It's not going to get better with more time. Come eat." She ate pasta at the kitchen table with Logan and Emma, who had sensed the tension in the room with the finely calibrated social radar of a child who has spent years reading adult atmospheres, and had decided the appropriate response was to tell Sienna an elaborate story about a disagreement at school that had involved a misattributed science project and an injustice of significant proportions. "Did you get it sorted out?" Sienna asked. "Eventually," Emma said. "I had evidence." "Good," Sienna said. "Evidence is important." Emma looked at her with the expression she sometimes got, that measuring, slightly too old look. "Is what you're doing kind of like that? Getting your evidence sorted out?" Logan said, "Emma." "It's okay," Sienna said. She looked at Emma. "Yeah, kind of exactly like that." Emma nodded, satisfied. "Then you'll be fine," she said, and went back to her pasta with the easy certainty of a kid who trusts that the right outcome follows from the right preparation. Sienna looked at Logan over Emma's head. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. Warren Costello arrived at 9:47 in a 10-year-old Subaru with 200,000 miles on it and a federal law enforcement badge that still looked current enough that it gave Sienna a small start when he produced it reflexively at the cabin door, before remembering he didn't need to. He was 68, with a face that had accumulated decades of listening to people explain things to him that weren't quite true, which had given it a particular settled skepticism that managed to be unsympathetic and non-hostile at the same time. He was neither warm nor cold. He was focused, in the way of people for whom a problem to be solved is a kind of relief. He shook Sienna's hand, shook Eleanor's, declined coffee, and sat down at the table. "Show me everything," he said. "In order. Don't tell me what it means. I'll tell you what it means." They went through it for 2.5 hours. Sienna presented the financial documents. Eleanor presented her historical records. Sienna walked him through the email thread, flagging the key passages without editorializing, letting the language speak for itself. Logan's shareholder documents, which Warren had been briefed on in the car, were presented last, with the trust provisions clearly marked. Warren asked 6 questions during the entire presentation. 4 of them were clarifying: dates, account numbers, document provenance. The 5th was about the forensic document examination of the signatures, which Eleanor answered with the specificity of a person who has given this testimony before. The 6th was about Priya. "The attorney who filed the response to the restraining order motion," he said. "What's her involvement going forward?" "She wants to be involved in the civil case," Sienna said. "She knows the filing history." "She should be." He made a note. "She'll be a useful bridge between the civil proceedings and whatever the federal case generates." At 12:30 a.m., he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a moment, the way people do when they are assembling something in their head. Then he said, "This is enough." The room was very quiet. "The signature forgery alone would be a difficult case in isolation," he said. "The financial records alone would be circumstantial without the forgery analysis. The historical pattern from 8 years ago would be dismissed as old and unsubstantiated without the current evidence. But assembled together, with the email thread establishing intent and planning, with the LLC registration trail connecting the historical and current operations, and with a shareholder-triggered independent audit as a mechanism that bypasses the normal reporting channels," he stopped. "This is enough to open a federal investigation that Richard Ashford cannot contain." Sienna's hands were in her lap. She didn't move them. "How long?" Eleanor said. "To open the investigation? I can make calls in the morning, the right calls to the right office with this package. A week, maybe 10 days, before the formal inquiry is underway." He looked at Sienna. You understand that once this opens, you can't unopen it. I understand. You may be called as a witness, publicly. The civil case will intersect with the federal case in ways that are going to create press coverage. I understand. He looked at her for a moment. You're sure? I'm very sure, she said. He said I don't know how to dismantle things. She paused. I want him to be wrong about that on the record. Something in Warren's expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, just the briefest relaxation of that settled skepticism. He gathered the documents into the order he wanted them and put them in the briefcase he'd brought. Bigger than Eleanor's, more worn, the kind that had been in federal office buildings and courtrooms for 30 years. I'll be in touch, he said. He stood, shook their hands again, looked at Eleanor. Good work. 8 years of good work, Eleanor said. The right time matters as much as the evidence, he said. You read it correctly. He picked up the briefcase. Lock up after I leave. He walked out into the mountain night and drove away in the Subaru, and Sienna and Eleanor stood in the cabin doorway and listened to the engine fade. Eleanor said, Go sleep. You too, Sienna said. Eleanor walked down the path. Sienna closed the cabin door and turned the lock. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she went to the stove, adjusted the damper to the correct position, added 2 logs at the right angle, and sat down at the table in the quiet. What came next was fast, and it was public, and it was, as Warren had promised, uncontainable. His calls took 6 days, not 7. On the morning of the 7th day, Sienna's phone showed a news alert. Not a Google alert for her own name, but a financial news notification she'd set up to track Varden Capital. Varden Capital Group subject of federal financial crimes investigation. CEO and associates under scrutiny for alleged wire fraud and securities violations. Richard's name was in the 3rd paragraph. She read the article twice, standing in the kitchen corner of the cabin with the coffee she'd just made, and she felt not triumph exactly. Something more complicated than triumph, something that had weight to it but wasn't quite satisfaction either. More like the particular exhaustion and release of a person who has been braced for a physical blow for a very long time and can finally, at last, stop holding their body that way. Priya called at 7:30 a.m. The restraining order motion was withdrawn, she said, without preamble. His attorneys filed the withdrawal this morning, an hour after the news broke. Okay, Sienna said. The independent audit was formally triggered by Logan Mercer's trust management firm at 9 a.m. yesterday. I don't know if you knew that was coming. Logan told me last night. A pause. How are you doing? Sienna thought about it seriously, the way she'd learned. Somewhere in the cabin, in the weeks of working and waiting and adjusting the damper, to think about things seriously instead of quickly. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me in a week. I'll ask you in a week, Priya said. I'll also need to talk to you about the civil case strategy. It's going to shift significantly now. I know. Call me tomorrow. She hung up and stood at the window. The news moved faster than even Warren had anticipated. By noon, 2 of Richard's 3 co-defendants, Donovan Hale and a Varden Capital board member whose initials she'd matched to the emails, had retained separate counsel, which in Sienna's experience meant they were already calculating the distance between their own exposure and Richard's and finding it shorter than they'd like. By 5 p.m., the story had been picked up by the national financial press. By 8 p.m., it was on cable news, where a panel of legal analysts were discussing it with the particular energized uncertainty of people who have just been handed a story they don't yet fully understand. Richard Ashford was arrested on federal charges of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering at 6:43 the following morning at his home in Charlotte by 3 federal agents, and a warrant that Eleanor told Sienna later had been authorized in record time because the documentation had been so comprehensively prepared that the reviewing judge had found nothing to delay it on. Sienna found out via a text from Priya that just said, "It's done." She was in the workshop at the time, sitting at the computer entering the last of Logan's billing corrections, and she read the text and sat very still for a moment and then went back to the billing. Logan came in from the lumberyard at 8 o'clock, saw her face, and stopped. He was arrested, she said. He set down the board he was carrying, propped it against the wall, and sat on the wooden stool near the workbench. He didn't say anything immediately, which was the right instinct. "Are you okay?" he said after a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I thought I'd feel something more definitive." "What do you feel?" She considered it. "Tired," she said. "Really tired. And I keep thinking about all the things I signed without reading carefully enough. All the moments when I was in the wrong place looking in the wrong direction. I keep running the tape back." "That's not useful," he said. "I know it's not useful." "Then stop running it." She looked at him. "That's the whole advice?" "You can't change the tape," he said. "You can change what comes after it." He said it without philosophy, without elevation, just plainly, the way he said most things. You built a company from nothing. He used it and tried to take it. You found out, you proved it, and now he's in handcuffs. A pause. "That's the tape from here on out. If you want." She looked at the computer screen. The billing document, clean and organized and correct. 3 years of Logan's work, finally legible. "The board called," she said. "Yesterday, 2 of them. They want me to come back." Logan's expression didn't change, but something behind it went careful. "What did you say?" "Nothing yet. I said I'd be in touch." "What do you want to say?" She turned away from the computer and looked at the workshop. The smell of it, the wood and the oil and the sawdust that had become over the weeks as familiar as any place she'd ever been. The high windows, the slow, patient machinery, the half-finished cabinet in the far corner that Logan had been working on in increments. A piece of furniture for someone who'd been waiting months and hadn't complained once about the timeline. "I don't know yet," she said. And for once, not knowing didn't feel like failure. "I don't know what I want." "That's probably the most honest thing you've said in a while," he said. She almost smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," he said, and went back to the lumber. The board's phone calls continued over the next 3 days. 4 different members, ranging from carefully apologetic to brazenly self-interested, all of them framing their request as being about the company's future, all of them betraying in one way or another that what they were really doing was managing their own liability, now that the story had fully turned. A company led by the wrongly accused CEO, vindicated by federal investigation, was a better story than a company that had driven out its founder. They needed her back in the frame. She listened to all of them and committed to nothing. Eleanor called on the 3rd day, the day the federal investigation formally issued a public statement that included, for the first time, official language acknowledging that preliminary forensic analysis supported the claim that the contested authorization signatures were forged. Not definitive and not a verdict, but official acknowledgement. The story changed shape in the press within hours of the statement. The framing shifted from former CEO under scrutiny to founder emerges as potential victim of elaborate fraud. Sienna read the new coverage sitting on the cabin porch in the cold, wrapped in her coat, with a coffee that had gone cold because she'd forgotten to drink it. She thought about the woman on the cover of Forbes 2 years ago, on the rooftop of the Meridian, thinking the headline was too small. She thought about the woman in the Volvo 3 weeks after that, doing arithmetic over crackers on a church wall. She wasn't either of those women right now. She was something in between them, or possibly something else entirely. A version she hadn't gotten clear sight of yet, that was still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. Emma found her on the porch an hour later, on her way back from the path to the workshop, and stopped. "You're not cold?" Emma said, because the temperature was 41 degrees. "I forgot to go inside," Sienna admitted. Emma sat down on the porch step without being invited. She had a granola bar she broke in half and offered the larger piece to Sienna, which Sienna accepted. "Dad said you might be leaving soon," Emma said. Not with distress, just information gathering. "I might be. There's a lot to deal with, the company, the legal stuff." She paused. "I don't know what comes next." "That's okay," Emma said. "Dad says that's when the interesting part starts." Sienna looked at her. "Does he?" "He said it when we moved here. We didn't know anyone, and the shop wasn't making money yet, and I was scared about school." Emma looked at the granola bar. "He wasn't trying to make me feel better, he was just... He actually thinks that's true." A pause. "He's usually right about things like that. Not always. He was wrong about Gerald." "What happened with Gerald?" Gerald was not a squirrel, Emma said, with the gravity of someone reporting a significant taxonomic correction. Gerald was a groundhog. Dad said squirrel for 2 weeks. Sienna ate her half of the granola bar and looked out at the mountain and felt, slowly and without forcing it, something that was cleaner than the complicated thing she'd been carrying since the arrest. Something that didn't have a clear name, but moved in the direction of forward. Inside the workshop, she could hear Logan working, the steady rhythm of it, wood against wood, the particular sound of something being made. She sat on the porch and listened to it. She thought about the board members and their careful calls and their calculated re-invitations and what she actually wanted, separate from what had been taken from her and whether it could be returned. Those were 2 different questions, and she'd been conflating them for days. The company was one thing. What she wanted to build was another. She didn't know yet if they were the same, but she was, for the first time since Charlotte, asking the right question. And that, she thought, finishing the granola bar in the 41-degree mountain morning, with a groundhog named Gerald somewhere in the tree line, and a 9-year-old sitting on the step beside her and the sound of careful work coming from below, was somewhere to start. The answer to the board came to her not as a decision exactly, but as a clarity that arrived the way most real things do. Sideways, when she wasn't looking directly at it. It was a Tuesday, 10 days after Richard's arrest, and she was in the workshop with Logan going through the last of the billing corrections when he asked her, without looking up from the chair leg he was sanding, whether she'd ever been to the Crestwood property. "What Crestwood property?" she said. "The old lodge, up the ridge, about 4 miles north. It's been empty for 8 years. The family that owned it let it go to the bank sat on it, then some investment group bought it and never did anything with it." He set down the sandpaper and picked up a different grit. "I've been looking at it for 2 years. The bones are good. Original chestnut interior, mid-century construction, but built well, on 40 acres with a creek on the south boundary." A pause. "I keep thinking about what it could be." Sienna looked up from the computer. "What do you mean, what it could be?" "A lodge. A proper one. Not a hotel, not a resort, something smaller. 8 or 10 rooms, common spaces, the kind of place people go when they actually want to be in the mountains instead of just near them." He was still focused on the chair leg, which she'd noticed was how he talked about things that mattered to him, with his hands occupied, like the work gave him permission to say the words. "The property has everything. The access road is bad, but it's fixable. The structure is sound. I could restore the interior in 6 months if I had a crew. The design's already in my head." "You've been planning this," she said. "Thinking about it," he corrected. "Planning would require money I didn't have a reason to access." He looked up briefly. "The trust changes that calculation. The management firm has been telling me for years to put the distributions towards something real instead of putting them back in. I've been ignoring them because I didn't have a project worth doing." He set the chair leg down. "This is a project worth doing." Sienna looked at him. He looked at the chair leg. "You're asking me something," she said. "I'm telling you about a property," he said. "Logan." He looked up. The particular quality of his silence in that moment was the kind that had a shape to it. The silence of a man who has thought carefully about something and arrived at an edge and is deciding whether to step over it. "You know hospitality," he said. "Not the corporate version of it, the actual version. What makes a place feel like something worth returning to? You built that from nothing before Richard got anywhere near it." He stopped. "I know design and construction. I don't know the business side in any serious way. My financial records were a disaster." A slight pause that might have been the ghost of dry humor. "You organized them in 6 days." Sienna was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to go into business with you," she said. "I'm asking if you'd want to think about it," he said. "There's a difference." There was a difference, and the fact that he'd made it told her something. He wasn't pushing. He'd laid out the shape of a thing and left space around it, which was, she was realizing, exactly how he did everything. He built the frame and let other people decide what to put inside it. "Can I see the property?" she said. He picked the chair leg back up. Saturday morning. They drove up to the Crestwood property on Saturday in Logan's truck, on an access road that was indeed bad. Rutted gravel with 2 sections of significant washout that required careful navigation, and one moment where the truck's front right tire went somewhere that made Sienna grip the door handle and say nothing, and pulled into a clearing in front of a long, low building that sat against the tree line like it had been there long enough to have opinions about it. It was not, at first look, impressive. The porch boards were rotted in 3 places. 2 of the 8 windows on the main facade were cracked, one with a piece of cardboard taped over the break from the inside. The sign that had once hung over the entrance was gone, leaving 2 rusted bolt holes in a pale rectangle on the wood where the stain hadn't faded behind it. The grounds had gone back to forest in the way that mountain property does when nobody is paying attention. The flower beds swallowed, the stone pathways cracked and scattered. A beautiful old oak at the corner of the building that had dropped a significant branch onto the roof at some point in the last several years. The branch still lying there, patient and immovable. Emma had come with them. She was out of the truck before Logan had fully stopped it, moving toward the building with the uninhibited directness of a child who sees a thing and wants to understand it. "It's not done," Emma called back, which was not an observation but an assessment. "Nothing good ever is when you first see it," Logan said. He had the key from the property management company. He'd been in contact with them, apparently, for months, which told Sienna something about how seriously he'd been thinking about this. And he opened the front door and they went inside. And there it was. The interior was dim and cold and smelled like a building that had been closed up too long, and in places the ceiling had water staining and one corner of the main room had gone soft from years of a minor roof leak. The floors needed work. The kitchen was decades out of date. The bathrooms were, as Emma said with frank accuracy, very bad. But the bones. The main room had 12-foot ceilings with original chestnut beams. Actual American chestnut, the real kind, from before the blight took them all, milled from trees that had stood when this part of the mountains was a different world. The stone fireplace was floor to ceiling, 8 feet wide, built by someone who understood proportion. The windows, where they weren't cracked, looked out over a south-facing slope that in summer would be green down to the creek, and in fall would be the kind of color that people drove hours to see. Sienna stood in the middle of the main room for a long time. She thought about the Meridian, the first property, the one she'd inherited from her uncle at 23 and spent 2 years restoring before it was ever open, working with contractors who were better than she could really afford, learning as she went, making mistakes that cost her time and money, and occasionally both simultaneously. She thought about standing in a gutted dining room in Charleston at 24 with no ceiling and no floor and contractor bills due in 2 weeks and an opening date. She'd promised a travel magazine that was looking increasingly optimistic and deciding that the marble she'd found at a salvage yard was right for the entry hall, even though it was going to cost 3 months' worth of her personal salary to install. She thought about what the Meridian had become. She thought about what this place could become. She turned around. Logan was watching her from the doorway to the back hallway, one shoulder against the frame, reading her the way she'd noticed he read things, quietly, without rushing the conclusion. Emma was standing at the fireplace, her head tilted back, looking up at the chimney opening with the expression she got when she was filing something away. "What do you see?" Logan said, not challenging, just asking. 8 rooms, Sienna said. Maybe 9 if you reconfigure the back section. A dining room that uses the full south window wall, not hotel dining, family style, long tables, local sourcing. Common spaces that feel like someone actually thought about how people sit together. She looked at the beams. You don't touch those. You don't refinish them. You don't stain them darker to be fashionable. You clean them and you let them be what they are. She looked at the fireplace. That's the heart of the room. Everything faces it. Logan said nothing for a moment. "The access road," she said. "I can grade it properly in 2 weeks with the right equipment," he said. "There's a local guy I use for the heavy work. The roof section over the corner. Replace the damaged section, reseal the whole thing. It's a 2-week job. Kitchen, full gut and rebuild. I know a kitchen designer in Asheville who does good commercial work without making everything look like a magazine photo." A slight pause. "I've already called her, hypothetically." Sienna looked at him. "Hypothetically. Hypothetically," he said without apparent guilt. She looked back at the room. The cold and the dust and the water stains and the branch on the roof and the rotted porch boards and all of it, The whole beautiful, broken, absolutely fixable thing. What's your timeline? She said. 6 months to opening if we start in January. 8 months if we're being honest about unexpected problems, which there will always be. Budget. The trust will cover construction and first-year operating costs. After that, it needs to sustain itself. He looked at her directly. That's the part I don't know how to do. I do, she said. I know, he said. Emma turned around from the fireplace. She had a look on her face that was difficult to read, the measuring look, the slightly too old one. And she said, to no one specifically, "Are we going to fix it?" Logan looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at the beams. "Yeah," she said. "I think we are." Emma turned back to the fireplace, satisfied, and began mentally rearranging furniture in the way that 9-year-olds do when they've already decided an outcome and are working forward from it. She called the board that afternoon. Not the individual members who'd been calling her. The chair, directly. A woman named Patricia Oakes, who had been on the Ashford board since the beginning and who, unlike several of her colleagues, had at least had the decency to stay quiet during the worst of it, rather than issuing statements that hedged toward Richard's version. Patricia answered on the second ring. "Sienna," she said, with the particular careful warmth of someone who is relieved to be spoken to directly. "Patricia," Sienna said, "I'm going to make this short because I've thought about it enough, and I know what I'm saying. I'm not coming back as CEO." A pause. "Sienna, I'm not finished." She was sitting on the cabin porch, in the cold, which had become the place she went to think and to say hard things. "What happened to the company is not something I caused, but it is something I'm partly responsible for because I left too much operational access in the hands of someone I should have audited more carefully. That's on me. I know that." She paused. "The company is good. The properties are good. What you need is an operations CEO who is not carrying the weight of what this past year has been, and who can take the company through the next phase without the story attached to it. The story is clearing, Patricia said. The federal statement? The story is clearing, Sienna agreed, but it doesn't clear completely for at least a year, probably 2. A new CEO without the narrative is better for the company right now. I'm giving you my honest recommendation, not my personal preference. A longer pause. What do you want in return? Nothing, Sienna said. I want my name cleared, which the federal process will handle. I want the company to do well because I built it, and I care about that. She looked out at the mountain. I'm going to build something else. Something else, Patricia repeated, in the tone of someone who is processing a development they hadn't anticipated. Something smaller, Sienna said. Something I can actually be inside of, if the legal resolution goes as expected. And it would. Priya had been clear about that. The civil case was moving quickly toward a settlement that would unfreeze her assets and result in a formal acknowledgement of the fraud. I'll have access to my personal accounts again within 60 days. I have a project. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with what sounded like genuine feeling rather than corporate sentiment, I should have been louder when things started to move against you. Yes, Sienna said. You should have been. She said it without anger, because she'd moved past the part of this where anger was useful. But here we are. Here we are, Patricia said. They talked for another 20 minutes about the transition, about the CEO search, about the formal structure of Sienna's departure. Patricia was, as she'd always been, efficient and fair when she was paying attention, and she was paying attention now. By the end of the call, the shape of it was clear enough. Sienna hung up and sat in the cold for another few minutes. She felt lighter. Not empty. Lighter. The way you feel when you've been carrying something at an awkward angle and you finally set it down and find your normal posture again. Priya called 2 weeks later with the news that the civil settlement had been reached. The fraud findings from the federal investigation had moved faster than the defense attorneys had anticipated, and Richard, facing federal charges and a civil case that was now going in one direction only, had instructed his legal team to settle. The terms were clean, full restoration of Sienna's frozen assets, formal acknowledgement that the fraudulent transfers had been made without her knowledge or authorization, and a monetary settlement that Priya had negotiated to a number that made Sienna sit down on the cabin floor for about 30 seconds. That's the number, Priya confirmed. They didn't want to go to trial. No, Sienna said from the floor. I imagine they didn't. Are you sitting on the floor? For a moment. Okay. Priya's voice had the tone of someone who has seen stranger things. Take a moment, then call your bank. She called her bank. It took 3 weeks for the full legal formalities to clear, for the accounts to be fully restored, for the paperwork to move through the channels it needed to move through. During those 3 weeks, she stayed in the cabin, kept working through the design plans for the Crestwood property with Logan, had 4 more meetings with Eleanor to support the ongoing federal investigation as a cooperating witness, called her mother twice. The second call was long and honest and difficult in places and necessary in every place, and spent a Saturday afternoon helping Emma with a school project about mountain ecosystems that turned into a 3-hour conversation about watershed dynamics that neither of them had expected. Richard Ashford pleaded guilty to reduced federal charges in a negotiated arrangement that his attorneys had spent significant effort constructing and that still carried a mandatory sentence that made the financial press write the kind of headlines that would follow his name permanently. Donovan Hale and the Varden Capital board member cooperated with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced exposure. The independent audit of Varden Capital, triggered by Logan's shareholder rights, produced findings that resulted in the dissolution of the fund's management structure and the recovery of assets that were distributed to a list of creditors and claimants that included several other parties who had been waiting years for exactly this. Eleanor called the morning after the guilty plea was announced. It's done, she said. It's done, Sienna said. How do you feel? It was the same question Logan had asked the morning of the arrest. She gave Eleanor the same honest answer. I don't know yet. That's reasonable, Eleanor said. It takes time to stop organizing around a threat. A pause. What are you doing now? Building something, Sienna said. She could hear Eleanor almost smile. Good. That's what you should be doing. They broke ground on the Crestwood restoration in the first week of January. Logan had assembled a crew of 6 local craftsmen, most of whom he'd worked with before, 2 of whom had been doing restoration work in the mountain counties for 20 years, and brought with them a particular kind of knowledge about old construction that you couldn't learn from books. Sienna was there the first morning, in work boots she'd bought in Nashville, and a canvas jacket similar to Logan's that she'd gotten because the cashmere coat was wrong for this kind of work, and she'd known it for 2 months, standing in the Crestwood clearing in the January cold watching the first equipment arrive. It was not glamorous, it was cold and loud, and the access road, even after grading, tested everyone's patience twice a week, and the unexpected problems Logan had predicted materialized with the reliable creativity of old buildings asserting their right to be complicated. The corner roof section turned out to have structural damage that extended into 2 rafters, adding 3 weeks and a significant cost overrun. The original plumbing, when they opened it up, was worse than the inspection had suggested, which added another 2 weeks. One of the chestnut beams had a crack that a structural engineer needed to evaluate before they could proceed with the ceiling work, and the evaluation took 10 days. None of it stopped them. Sienna managed the business architecture of it from the Crestwood property and the workshop in alternating days, the permits and the vendor relationships, and the market positioning and the booking structure and the website and the staffing plan, all of it building in parallel with the physical work. She was doing the work she knew how to do, but she was doing it differently than she'd done it before. Not at the scale of a company that required her to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, but at a scale where she could see the whole of it, where her decisions had direct visible consequences, where the thing she was building had her hands on it in a way the Ashford properties eventually hadn't. She understood, doing this work, what she'd lost along the way to becoming the woman on the Forbes cover. Not the money or the status. She'd never been particularly attached to those. She'd just been good at generating them and had confused competence for calling. What she'd lost was the particular engagement of work you could actually touch. She'd gotten so good at managing that she'd stopped making, and somewhere in that shift something essential had gone quiet. It was loud again now. Logan designed every interior element by hand, the furniture, the built-ins, the fixtures, all of it drawn on paper before it was made in the workshop. All of it made in the workshop before it was installed in the lodge. It was slow. It was the slowest way to do it. It also meant that every piece in every room had a specific logic to it, a reason it was the shape it was and the proportion it was. And that logic was visible when you were in the space in the way that mass-produced things never are. Emma came on Saturdays. She had decided, with no particular announcement, that the lodge was her project too, and she approached this claim with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything she decided to care about. She talked to Logan about the design of the common spaces. She talked to Sienna about what kinds of guests they wanted and what those guests would need. She brought home library books about mountain ecology and left them on the Crestwood kitchen counter with certain pages marked, which turned out to be her way of making the argument for an interpretive trail on the south property. A path with markers explaining the watershed and the tree species and the way the mountain worked. They built the trail. Emma made the markers herself, with Logan's help, in the workshop, small carved wooden signs with painted text that she agonized over for 2 weekends until the font was right. 6 months became 8, and 8 became 9, because the unexpected problems were plentiful and unrepentant. But the last weeks of September arrived, and the lodge was ready. Not perfect. Sienna needed to be clear about that in her own head, because perfect was the wrong standard, and she'd spent enough time building things to know that perfect was what you used as an excuse to never open the door. The kitchen ran hot in the northeast corner, and the chef they'd hired had figured out a workaround and said she could live with it. One of the guest room doors swelled in high humidity and required a firm shoulder to open, which Logan had promised to fix before winter, and which was genuinely on his list. The stone path from the parking area to the entrance needed a section relaid because the ground had shifted under it over summer, and that was scheduled for October. The rest of it was real. That was the word Sienna kept coming back to. Not flawless, not magazine perfect. Real in the way that things are real when they've been made by people who cared about them, which is a different quality than anything you can manufacture or replicate. The grand opening was a Friday evening in late September, with the trees on the ridge just beginning their turn. The first suggestion of amber and red in the upper canopy, the air with that particular edge that means summer is finishing and something better is coming. They'd invited 30 people, the crew who'd built it, the vendors they'd worked with, a handful of local press, Eleanor and Priya and Warren Costello, who drove up from Raleigh again in the Subaru and walked through the rooms with the quiet interest of a man who had seen a great many outcomes and was calibrating this one. He found Sienna on the main room's back porch, which looked down the south slope toward the creek, now invisible in the trees, the sound of it audible on still evenings. "How does it feel?" he said. "Better than I expected," she said honestly, "and I expected it to feel good." He looked at the slope. "The federal case concludes formally in November. Richard will be sentenced in December. There may be some residual press around that." "I know. You'll be asked to comment. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said. And it was apparent this kind of personal statement cost him something, coming from a man who had spent decades in the discipline of professional detachment. "The documentation you and Eleanor assembled was among the cleaner packages I've ever been handed. You made the investigation possible. It mattered." "Eleanor made it possible," Sienna said. "She kept those records for 8 years. She kept the records," Warren said. "You connected them to something they could act on." He looked at her briefly. "Don't minimize the part you played. It's a habit worth breaking." He went back inside. Sienna stood on the porch for another minute. She thought about minimizing, about all the ways she'd done it over the years, moved past her own accomplishments quickly, the way she'd moved past the kindness at the train station, the way she'd told Logan it was nothing and meant it, the way she'd spent 30 years being good at things without fully stopping to feel what that meant. She'd confused momentum for living. She'd been so focused on the next thing that she'd passed through the present tense of her own life without sitting down in it. She didn't want to do that anymore. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a lesson she'd written down and framed. It was just something she knew now, the way you know things that have been earned rather than told to you. In the body, in the chest, settled and specific and harder to lose than anything you've only read. Inside, she could hear Logan's voice. He was showing Warren the chestnut beams, explaining the structural history, which he did with everyone who would listen because he found it genuinely interesting and had the kind of enthusiasm for material and construction that was contagious if you let it be. She could hear Emma somewhere in the dining room, directing a conversation between Eleanor and the chef about the interpretive trail, which Emma had been waiting to explain to Eleanor specifically because Eleanor had asked the right questions the first time she'd heard about it. Sienna came back inside. The room was warm, the great fireplace going, the chestnut beams overhead, the long dining tables set with candles, the south windows showing the darkening slope, and the first stars appearing above the ridge. It smelled like wood smoke and the garlic that the chef had been building into the evening's food for the past 2 hours, and the particular clean smell of the mountains that had found its way into the building over the summer and become part of it. She stood in the doorway from the porch and looked at the room. Eleanor was at the far end of the table, listening to Emma with the specific quality of attention she gave things she was genuinely interested in, which was not her default quality, but was unmistakable when it appeared. Priya was talking to one of the crew members near the fireplace, laughing at something he'd said. Warren was still with Logan near the beams, both of them looking up, Logan's hands moving in the way they did when he was describing something structural. It was not a perfect room. The lighting in the northeast corner was still slightly wrong. She'd known it when they installed the fixtures and had been telling herself she'd address it in the off-season, which she would. The door to the hallway had been repainted twice and was still not quite the right color. The rug in the center of the room was beautiful and slightly too small, which she'd known when she ordered it and had bought it anyway because the pattern was right, and you sometimes took what was right over what was correct. It was not perfect. It was exactly what they had meant to build. She crossed the room to where Logan was standing. He saw her coming and finished his sentence to Warren and turned toward her with the easy unhurriedness that was simply how he moved through the world, a quality she had cataloged in the months of knowing him the way you catalog things you want to understand. Not to take them apart, but because you want to be sure you're actually seeing them. "How are you doing?" he said. "Good," she said. And then, because she was trying not to minimize, "Really good. I think it worked." He looked around the room. "It worked," he said. It wasn't self-congratulation. It was just what it was. "The door in room 4 is going to be a problem before winter," she said. "I know. I'll get to it." "The lighting in the northeast, off-season," he said. "The rug is too small." He looked at the rug. "I know. It's the right rug, though." "It is," she agreed. They stood there for a moment side by side looking at the room. Not at each other. At the thing they'd made, which was its own kind of intimacy, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Emma appeared between them with the uncanny timing she had for positioning herself at the center of things. She had a candle from one of the tables in her hand, which she was not supposed to be carrying around, and she looked at both of them with the measuring expression that meant she was assembling information and hadn't finished yet. "Mrs. Eleanor says the trail markers are historically accurate," she announced. "Good," Logan said. She said remarkably accurate. "I didn't make it up." "I believe you," Sienna said. Emma looked satisfied. Then she looked at the room, the fireplace, and the beams, and the long tables, and the people gathered in the warmth, and she had the expression of someone who has seen something match the picture they had of it in their head, which is one of the better feelings available to a person and is particularly clear on the face of a child who has been imagining something for months and has finally arrived inside it. "I think we should do more of these," Emma said. "More lodges?" Logan said. "More of—" She made a gesture that encompassed the room, the people, the whole of it. "This, whatever this is." Logan looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at the room. She thought about a woman in a Volvo, doing desperate arithmetic over a pack of crackers, who had been 50 feet from a man she'd once helped without thinking about it, on a street she'd ended up on by accident, in a town she'd chosen only because she'd never been there. She thought about the specific improbability of it, not the magical kind of improbability, not the kind that makes you reach for the word fate, but the ordinary human kind, the kind that happens because people move through the world and occasionally the circles of their movement intersect. And what happens at the intersection depends entirely on whether anyone is paying attention and whether anyone is decent enough to act on what they see. She thought about a $300 hotel room and a sick child, and a small act done without expectation and forgotten within a week. She thought about a 9-year-old who had decided, with the absolute uncomplicated clarity available only to people who haven't yet learned to second-guess their instincts, that the act was worth keeping. She thought about a drawing in colored pencil, folded and refolded, held for 5 years, returned at exactly the right moment. She thought about what it meant that the right moment had arrived, not because of anything cosmic, just because Emma had kept the drawing, because Logan had brought coffee instead of asking questions, Because Eleanor had kept files for 8 years instead of letting go of the thing she knew was wrong. Because Priya had made one phone call she didn't have to make. Because Warren Costello had driven to Asheville on a Tuesday night in his 10-year-old Subaru because the documentation was clean and the cause was right. None of them had been looking for a story. None of them had been building toward something. They'd just been paying attention and doing what was in front of them. And what was in front of them had turned out to be this imperfect, complicated, slightly too small rug, door that swells in humidity, northeast corner lighting problem, genuinely beautiful thing. Yeah, Sienna said to Emma's suggestion. I think we should do more of these. Emma went back to Eleanor, candle in hand, and Sienna and Logan stood in the room they'd made and said nothing for a moment because nothing needed to be said. They were both people who'd learned, by different routes, at different costs, that the things worth having were not the things you acquired or protected or managed from a distance. They were the things you built with your hands and inhabited with your whole self and let be imperfect and stayed with anyway. Sienna Ashford had once been untouchable, and then she had been ruined, and then she had been, in the dark and the cold of a November mountain, found. Not rescued. She needed to be exact about that because she had rescued herself. With Eleanor's evidence and Logan's shareholder documents and Priya's legal mind and Warren's contacts and her own unwillingness, even at her lowest, to stop doing the work. She had built the thing that brought her back. She had always known how to build. What she hadn't known until Asheville, until the car and the coffee and the cabin and the 9 months of actual work, was that building something wasn't enough on its own. The building had to be for something real. It had to have people in it. It had to be the kind of place someone could stay. She was staying. The fire burned in this great fireplace. The beams were what they were, old and real and without apology. Outside, the mountain did what mountains do at night, which is exist with a completeness that has nothing to do with anyone watching it, and is beautiful for exactly that reason. Sienna Ashford, 31 years old, stood in the middle of the first room of the first lodge of whatever came next, and felt not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for it, and she was done with simple words for complicated things. She felt present. She felt, for the first time in a long time, completely and specifically where she was supposed to be. And that was enough. That was, it turned out, the whole thing. End.